Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to City and State Pennsylvania's 2022 Education Summit. My name is Greg Salisbury, Senior Editor of City and State Pennsylvania, and I'm happy to be your host and MC for the day. City and State is dedicated to delivering the news that affects local and state politics. Our in-depth, nonpartisan coverage serves as a trusted guide to the issues impacting our state. The 2022 Education Summit will bring together experts across the public and private sectors to assess the current state of Pennsylvania's educational infrastructure, break down recent legislative actions, and assess the future of learning in Pennsylvania. Please allow me to take a moment to thank our sponsors, WHYY, Western Governors University, and PCN. We'll begin with keynote remarks from Eric Haggerty, the Acting Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Education. Mr. Haggerty has spent the past decade in public service, including as Chief of Staff for the State Department of Community and Economic Development, and as a Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Tom Wolf. Among his accomplishments as Secretary, he led the team that secured more than $2 billion in education funding increases to date, including the largest single-year increase in Pennsylvania history for the 2021-2022 fiscal year. Eric?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Greg. I'm Eric Haggerty, Acting Secretary of Education. It's an honor to be here with you all for City and State's 2022 Pennsylvania Education Summit. I'm looking forward to listening to and learning from today's panelists. But before we get to the panels, I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about the current state of our education system here in Pennsylvania, where we've come from, where we're going, and some of the biggest challenges at the top of my mind as schools continue to navigate this new world brought on by the pandemic. As Greg said, I'm recently new to this role. It's been the honor of a lifetime to have the chance to serve in this capacity over the last few months. And although I'm new to the Department of Education, I was fortunate to serve as Governor Wolf's Deputy Chief of Staff for the last 6 or 7 years, and had the opportunity to work closely with and learn from former Secretaries Pedro Rivera and Noe Ortega, overseeing education issues alongside them. So there are a few things I want to touch on, much of which I know will be the subject of discussion during the panels, but some of which may not. Things like school funding and bolstering our educator workforce, but also student mental health and modernizing our post-secondary institutions. First and foremost, I think it's important to remind folks a little bit about what the state and the Department of Education do and don't do in the education field. Despite what you might hear, the Department of Education does not establish or mandate curriculum at the state level. As a Commonwealth, Pennsylvania has a rich tradition of local control when it comes to decision-making in a whole host of areas, and in the world of education, it's no different. So we're a little unique in that regard compared to other states who may establish curriculum at the state level. So what we do, however, is work as hard as we can to ensure that schools have the resources they need to give every student the opportunity to succeed, no matter what zip code they come from. And to date, efforts to make sure kids in every zip code get a fair shake have revolved a lot around funding reforms. That's because Pennsylvania has historically disproportionately relied on local property taxes to pay for schools. And this is problematic, of course, because different communities have different abilities to pay for schools. So we ended up with a system here in which one community might have world-class facilities and another community a mile down the road has leaky roofs. And to make matters worse, what relatively little state funding we have historically contributed, each district, their allocation was locked in based on numbers from 1992. And as you all know, the size and needs of our communities have changed a little bit since 92. So I'm really proud that throughout the 8 years of Governor Wolf's time in office, we've made steady progress to not only increase the total amount of state funding schools receive, so they're less reliant on property taxes, but we've also made steady progress to change the formulas that determine how that increased funding is allocated among Pennsylvania's 500 school districts. So for starters, in 2015, a bipartisan Basic Education Funding Commission established what is now known as the Fair Funding Formula. So rather than simply using head counts from 1992, this formula includes student head counts, but also includes other factors that are relevant, such as district poverty levels, the number of English language learners, students enrolled in charter schools, sparsity adjustments for the unique costs incurred by small rural school districts, as well as a community's capacity to raise local property tax revenue. All new basic education funding since Governor Wolf took office has been allocated according to this formula. And following the historic budget Governor Wolf signed into law last month, the total increase in basic education funding throughout his time in office is over $2 billion. And to give you a sense of what that represents, in 2014, schools were receiving around $5.5 billion from the state, and this year they'll receive $7.6 billion. So that's a nearly 40% increase over the last 8 years in the state share of funding for school districts. But given the low point we started from, Pennsylvania, as recently as a couple of years ago, still only ranked 44th in the country in terms of the percentage of school funding paid for by the state. And unfortunately, the $5.5 billion schools were receiving prior to Governor Wolf taking office is still allocated based on those 1992 numbers. So even though we've steadily increased funding, less than a third of it is actually allocated based on the fair funding formula. So that's why last year, in partnership with the General Assembly, we created the Level Up program. And this is a program intended to accelerate the pace at which schools who are struggling the most because of a lack of equitable funding by the state can catch up more quickly. So in that first year of the program, $100 million was set aside for the 100 most historically disadvantaged and underfunded school districts. This year, in our second year, an astounding $225 million has been set aside for those 100 districts that need it the most. And it's been incredible to see the extent to which these critical investments are already bearing fruit for these needy school districts. I'm tremendously proud of the progress we've made over the last 8 years, but there is still much more that will need to be done before we can truly say we have equitable funding in Pennsylvania and that every student has a fair shot at success, no matter what zip code they come from. And I know you'll be discussing that a little bit later in one of the panel sessions. And so as we've all seen, the pandemic has really upended our economy and labor markets, and it's had major implications for our higher education sector. Of the 23 million Americans who lost their jobs between January and May of 2020, 46% of those folks had a high school diploma or less, and 24% had some college but no credential. Yet by 2027, we anticipate that 70% of all jobs nationwide are going to require some education beyond high school. Yet Pennsylvania's post-secondary attainment rate is only around 51%. So it's a huge challenge in front of us. And of course, that doesn't tell the whole story because there are major disparities by race and ethnicity. In Pennsylvania, 65% of Asians have a post-secondary credential, 47% of white people do, 37% of Native Americans do, 30% of Black or African American people do, and just 24% of Hispanic people do. And only 55% of the graduating class of 2020 enrolled in a post-secondary institution. And to top that off, there are over 1 million people in Pennsylvania over the age of 25 who have some college but no credential. So what this tells me isn't that there's something wrong with these students who aren't enrolling or those who don't have a post-secondary credential yet. It tells me that our institutions of higher education are not designed to serve today's post-secondary students. No matter their age, today's post-secondary learners more likely than not have adult responsibilities such as being financially independent from their parents, working, parenting themselves while enrolled. So I really think we need to stop talking about making kids college ready and start talking about making our colleges student ready. Thankfully, there are a ton of great institutions in Pennsylvania leading the way. Just a few examples. At Delaware County Community College, students can participate in a skilled trades dual enrollment program where high school students can earn a 27 to 30 credit course for free or at a reduced rate. Chestnut Hill College designed courses in areas of high employer interest, primarily for working students. East Stroudsburg is continuing to offer online and hybrid courses for working adults. And of course, PASHE is undertaking a historic transformation initiative. And next month, I'm excited to share that our State Board of Education will be taking up a proposed new master plan for higher education that we've been developing that's intended to increase credential completion to meet the Commonwealth's need for talent, erase equity gaps in post-secondary access, completion by race, ethnicity, income, age, gender, and geography, increase college affordability for all Pennsylvanians, innovate and redesign our post-secondary institutions to meet the needs of today's learners, and also increase the transparency on the value of these post-secondary credentials. And just as our colleges and universities have necessarily had to adapt to the changing student population, so too do our K-12 institutions need to do the same. It's hard to believe, but we are starting what will be the fourth school year in which COVID-19 will be seen and felt. And it's important to remember that throughout the pandemic, just like adults, students have had to navigate immense hardship, unprecedented loss of life, loss of family members and loved ones, loss of teachers in some cases, feeling isolated and without any sort of normal grieving process. There were many students who, depending on their age, may have never stepped foot in a classroom in their lives until this past school year, or missed out on what normal transitions to middle or high school are like, or graduations and proms, all of which they've had to experience in this context of hyper online and digital social environments. And so the stories we all hear about students struggling with mental health in this context are really not just anecdotes, and I want to stress that. It's been worrisome to learn that according to our most recent annual survey of hundreds of thousands of K-12 students, nearly 20% reported seriously considering committing suicide at some point in the last year. And that is much, much higher than it was a decade ago. So it is really critical that as schools get back to basics this year, we need to keep student mental health front and center. These students are depending on us to not only educate them, but in many cases, get them through some of the darkest experiences of their lives. I myself am someone who has struggled with depression and anxiety at various points in my life, and I've been fortunate to receive the mental health supports I needed when I needed it most. So I hope, if there are any students or teachers out there listening who may be struggling themselves, please know that help is available, and it can and does get better. But we have to talk about it. We've got to destigmatize it. And I think a good start would be getting at least one mental health professional in every school building. And that's a challenge I hope we undertake in the near future. Of course, schools are facing some enormous operational challenges that make it harder to provide those types of services that we know kids need. I think if you were to talk to superintendents throughout Pennsylvania, the vast majority of them would say that the educator workforce challenges they're facing are at the top of their priority list. Over the last decade, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the number of people entering the field of education. 10 years ago, roughly 20,000 new educators entered our classrooms here in Pennsylvania. But last year, there were only around 6,000 who did so. And to make matters worse, the rate at which existing educators are leaving the field is accelerating. What's even more concerning is the fact that in Pennsylvania, fewer than 7% of our teachers are people of color, which of course is nowhere near representative of the student population we're here to serve. And study after study has demonstrated that a student's chance of success greatly increases when they have access to a teacher that looks like them or has a shared lived experience. And it isn't just students of color who benefit from teachers of color. White kids do too. We all benefit from the opportunity to learn from a diverse array of individuals, both similar and different from ourselves. And of course, we know that the last few years have been among the most challenging times ever to be an educator. Teachers now more than ever wear many different hats on any given day. They lead instruction, provide social and emotional support, cover classrooms that can't find a substitute, address medical needs, feed students, so much more. I often hear from teachers that they feel like several decades ago, they were among the most revered members of the community. Yet today, they have a sense that some of that respect has been lost. It is certainly rarely glamorous, but it is so critically important, and we've got to find ways to encourage more people to answer the call and enter the classroom. because the consequences of allowing these trends to continue will be dramatically larger class sizes and reduced course offerings. That's why last month I unveiled our new plan to bolster the educator workforce. After conducting extensive feedback sessions across Pennsylvania with teachers, administrators, education prep programs, and more, we've laid out over 100 action steps we're going to take between now and 2025 to ensure a robust pipeline of teachers in our classrooms for years to come. Our plan includes things like issuing grant opportunities to strengthen the relationships between schools and educator prep programs, modernizing our teacher certification process, and reducing our processing times at the department from 10 weeks down to just 15 days, implementing new pathways for reciprocity for teachers already certified in another state, reducing unnecessary barriers like the basic skills assessment that we've heard is not an indicator as to whether a teacher will be great or not, developing the data collection and reporting processes we need to measure our progress, expanding grow your own programs, increasing the number of education prep providers, and so much more. We've also recently created a chief talent officer position at the department, and this person will be responsible for implementing our plan and focusing on diversifying our educator workforce. And if you'd like to learn more about our educator workforce strategy, because it is extensive, the plan itself and a 20-page overview of the feedback we heard from the field are available on our website at education.pa.gov. So we've made tremendous progress over the last 8 years, but as you can tell, there are certainly major obstacles and challenges to overcome in the foreseeable future. But of course, our team here at the Department of Education can't and shouldn't do it all. You know, we play a small part in Pennsylvania's educational ecosystem. And that's why I'm encouraged by the cross-section of elected officials, policymakers, advocates, and school leaders participating here today. Because if we're going to tackle these challenges and truly deliver an educational system that guarantees success for kids in every zip code, it's going to take all of us working together. So thank you again for the opportunity to join you all today. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussions, and it's great again to be here with you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric Haggerty. Now we'll have a brief message from WHYY, and here is Tori Harris to present it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Greg. Hello, I'm Tori Harris, WHYY's Director of Public Information, and I'm honored to join you today. When many people think of WHYY, they usually think of PBS or NPR, our original podcast, and our local news. But many people don't know that WHYY also has 47 media labs in schools across Philadelphia and after-school and summer programs for adults and students that teach audio and video production and also prepare young people for careers in media. Now, WHYY has created a 5-part animated series about the Constitution, with episodes on criminal justice, immigration, states' rights, and racial and gender disparities. These videos break things down for students and serve as a reminder for those of us who have been out of school for a little while. So we invite you to please go to WHYY's YouTube page now and subscribe so that you can be alerted about the September 13th launch date. Now we're going to take a moment to listen to series host, constitutional lawyer and professor Gloria Brown-Marshall tell us a little bit more about the series. Thank you.
Do you want to know more about your country? I'm Gloria J. Brown-Marshall, professor, constitutional geek, and host of WHYY's new animated series, Your Democracy. Understanding the Constitution can be fun. That's why I'm excited to invite you to watch Your Democracy. We'll talk about what it means to be an American citizen, voting rights, criminal justice, and much, much more. Your Democracy premieres Tuesday, September 13th on WHYY's YouTube channel. Subscribe today.
Thank you, Tori, and thank you, WHYY. We've certainly come a long way from Schoolhouse Rock. Let's begin with our first panel of the day. It's Reimagining Equitable Public Education in a Post-Pandemic World, moderated by Harrison Kahn, reporter with City and State, Pennsylvania. Please welcome Harrison Kahn.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks everybody for attending today. As Greg mentioned, this panel is Reimagining Equitable Public Education in a Post-Pandemic World. And I am Harrison Kahn. I am the Philadelphia-based reporter here with City and State. To kick things off, I'm going to do a brief introduction of our panelists today, and they can introduce themselves afterwards. We are joined by Ron Cowell, Executive Director of the Education Policy and Leadership Center, Dr. Tony B. Watlinger Sr., the Superintendent of the School District of Philadelphia, State Senator Lindsey Williams, Representative of District 38 and Minority Chair of the Senate Education Committee, David Hardy, Senior Distinguished Fellow at the Commonwealth Foundation, and Laura Boyce, Pennsylvania Executive Director of Teach Plus. Ron, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks very much. A lot of the folks on here I've had the privilege to work with over some or a lot of the last 48 years. I spent 24 years in the legislature working on education issues. When I decided not to run for re-election, accepted an invitation to start the Education Policy and Leadership Center. And again, many of you know that we're Harrisburg based. We do programs around the state. And I'm happy to be part of this conversation. Thanks to City and State for hosting this important discussion.
Great, thanks, Ron. Dr. Watlington, would you like to introduce yourself? I believe we might be missing Dr. Watlington in a second. So we're going to go to Senator Williams.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm State Senator Lindsey Williams. I represent the 38th Senate District in Allegheny County. It's a piece of the city of Pittsburgh, the North Hills, and the Allakiski Valley. I was elected in 2018. I am the Minority Chair of the Senate Education Committee. I've spent my career in workers' rights and education policy. My job right before running for office was as the communications and political director for the Pittsburgh Federation of Teachers. So I'm very proud to be here today. Thank you so much.
Great. Mr. Hardy.
Yes, my name is David Hardy. I'm an educator with 37 years experience here in Philadelphia. I worked initially in alternative education with students who were at risk. In 1997, I started working with the first charter school that opened in Philadelphia, and I've been in the charter sector ever since. My last charter mission was I started Pennsylvania's first single-gender charter school, and that would be Boyce Latin of Philadelphia. Glad to be here.
Great. Ms. Boyce?
To let Dr. Watlington go first because it looks like he was able to join us.
Oh, we could circle back to him. It's okay.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Laura Boyce. I'm the Pennsylvania Executive Director of Teach Plus, which is a national education nonprofit that works to advance equity for students through teacher voice and teacher leadership. We have been in Pennsylvania for about 5 years and have a number of different programs that all work to empower teachers to take ownership and have a seat at the table for key policy and practice issues. We have a statewide teaching policy fellowship with teachers from all over the state who work to advance equity in areas such as school funding, recruitment and retention of teachers of color, culturally affirming schools, and more. And my background, I was a high school English and history teacher in the School District of Philadelphia in both district and charter schools, and an elementary and middle school principal in Camden, New Jersey. Thank you for having me.
Great. And last but not least, Dr. Watlington.
Let me unmute myself here. Good afternoon, Tony Watlington, Superintendent of the School District of Philadelphia. I replaced Dr. Bill Height on June 16th here in the School District of Philadelphia. Prior to coming to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I was superintendent in Rowan Salisbury schools in Salisbury, North Carolina. North Carolina has 115 school districts, unlike the Commonwealth's 500. But among those 115 school districts in North Carolina, the legislature voted a few years ago to give one school district a waiver from state rules relative to budget, curriculum, school calendars, and the like, to see if the school district could get better faster. And certainly the school district was well on its way to doing that. Prior to that role, I served as chief of schools in Guilford County Schools, which is the third largest district in North Carolina with some 73,000 students. I was also a history teacher, bus driver, custodian, did a lot of jobs prior to becoming superintendent, and I'm very happy to be a part of this panel today to talk about equitable public education in a post-pandemic world.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks again to all our distinguished guests for being here. As Secretary Haggerty mentioned, we're now headed into the fourth academic year in which COVID will have an impact on learning. A bit of background, there's intense challenges facing the education system that were exacerbated by the pandemic. So we now really have an opportunity to forge new paths in education. Throughout an extended period of remote learning, access to technology has become a more obvious determinant of student success than ever, and student-wide teacher shortages have further complicated a lot of issues as well. So the broad question we're trying to look at here in this panel is, how do we best take advantage of this opportunity to reimagine and re-engineer policies and practices that have benefited some students over others? So the very first question is just going to be general, and anyone's welcome to answer this. In your line of work or in what you've experienced, what does equity look like to you?
I'll take a stab at that first. Certainly, as a former teacher, as a parent of three young men myself, and as a superintendent, I kind of view equity as the work we do to disrupt systems such that we cannot predict student outcomes by race and ethnicity, or by gender, or by socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and the like. And so aspirationally, we really want to not be able to predict outcomes by any defined characteristics. And sometimes that requires some structural and some systems changes in order to get different outcomes.
Yes, following up on that, equity in education is when all students have their needs met, they're given a fair opportunity to succeed in schools that are safe, inclusive, and affirming, and fully funded, and that there are some students that are going to, because of historic issues with racism or sexism or any kind of other socioeconomic background, that they might need more help to get to the point where they're able to succeed. And that's what we're all here to do.
I'd just add, and again, I'm on the sidelines. There are folks on this panel who are the real experts. They're in the trenches day after day. But there's been a lot of discussion about equity and what it means, what it looks like, and how we get there. A lot of it manifested through the trial that's been going on, and hopefully is going to reach some conclusion at one level, although whoever wins, or let me say whoever loses, is going to appeal to the state Supreme Court. So that trial is going to continue on for a while, most likely. But equity ought to recognize that not all kids start in the same place. And equitable education program ought to recognize that kids start in different places, but for each and all of them, there is a full opportunity to ultimately succeed. Now, there are lots of opportunities to define those words, but that's what educators and policymakers have been wrestling with for a long time. But for those who want to do a little bit more homework, I'd encourage them to look at some of the transcript and some of the highlights in terms of reporting that has come out of the Pennsylvania Schools Work campaign, because they've done a lot of good work. Sharon Ward is on here. Sharon has been a leader for a couple decades, I think, or maybe longer than that, around some of these advocacy issues. So there's a lot of good stuff out there for folks who are in the trenches, including superintendents who testified during the trial, who define what equity looks like and what it takes to get there.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think equity has to be looked at in the lens of outcomes for Black and brown children, because that's where the equity is not happening, and that's where the equity needs to start. It needs to start in what is available to them, what kind of opportunities are available to them, and the support and encouragement they get to participate in those opportunities. We tend to look at education in this state as a matter of inputs. We have to do this. They have to have enough funding. They have to have a building, and all those things are important. But education needs to be viewed as a matter of outputs. And we have too many places in Pennsylvania where there's just no output from our public educational dollar.
I'll just add on to what's been said. I very much agree with much of what was said in terms of equity being connected to making sure that students have opportunities to achieve equal outcomes and have barriers removed, which often means, as I told my students when I was in the classroom, that doesn't mean everyone necessarily always gets treated equally, but everyone gets what they need. The one thing that I would add is I do believe that equity in education is fundamentally tied to our beliefs about what children are capable of and what all children, including students of color, are capable of. I think as policymakers, as leaders, we have to really live out the belief that any child in any one of our classrooms, regardless if they are rich or poor, Black or white, rural, suburban, has the potential to be the next president, to be the next inventor of a vaccine. And if we truly, truly believe that and are able to get rid of some of our notions of, how a student's race or socioeconomic status is going to limit them, then a lot of our policy decisions will follow from that. And as Ron mentioned, the school funding lawsuit was really revealing as we heard some of the lawyers for the defense make statements about some of our students in underfunded districts saying that they were on the McDonald's track and not everybody needs high school biology or chemistry, that really reveal a lot about, whether we actually do have a mindset of believing that all of our students in Pennsylvania are capable of greatness. And I think that that's where it starts.
Harrison, I don't want us to fly by this distinction between inputs and outcomes, because that's a big part of the debate, not just in Pennsylvania, but all over the country for decades. I would suggest, it's just one guy's opinion, that the outcomes are the ultimate measure of whether we're succeeding or not in our effort to provide equitable education. But to get there, we cannot ignore, and too often we have ignored, we cannot continue to ignore the inputs. Is there a competent teacher? Is there appropriate class size? Has there been an opportunity for developmentally appropriate full-day kindergarten or other preschool programs? Do kids have access to an advanced placement course, or to international languages, or to science labs or musical instruments? Do they have a nice facility, a decent facility? I've been in schools, and with all due respect to the superintendent in Philadelphia, it's been more than 10 years, but I was in schools that had bathrooms that nobody on this call would want to go into. But we were telling kids that was their bathroom in their school. So we can't ignore the input question.
I will tell you that there's no question that there are some significant facility challenges in the school district of Philadelphia. I've worked in a couple of school districts in North Carolina where, the buildings are old, but they've been very well kept, and all of them are air conditioned. And so when I think about underfunding in one of America's prominent premier cities over time and some of the facility challenges, I do think it has equity implications. To your other point, though, I want to just note, you mentioned the piece about teachers. Now, the research literature in this country is crystal clear over 50 years. The single most impactful factor in students' academic growth and attainment is a highly qualified, well-supported, and stable teaching force over time. Now, when we consider the fact that the number of people going into teaching to public and private institutions across the U.S. is down by 50% over the past 5 years, and here in the Commonwealth, I'm told that number is as high as 65 to 67%. It begs the question, where do we make up the difference, and who gets those teachers and where, and who gets the stable teaching forces? And so we have to be very clear and honest to the point about outputs too, that we have to make sure to do a whole lot more work to be strategic in how we make sure that all children get access to highly qualified, stable teaching faculties. And there's lots of things that we can do to kind of support that. But I think that's really number one among the issues that I'm trying to pay attention to as a superintendent.
Well, I actually think the single most important factor about whether a child has a good education in Pennsylvania is your address. If you don't have the right address, you got no chance. And we know that there are addresses, kids who walk out of the door of a house, that we know that very few people who live around there who go to the schools to serve that address are going to get their needs met. So if we know this, we have to change it. We can't continue to have an address-based school system, school assignment system, when we know that that definitely means there will be people who will get an inferior education. We all know it, but nobody wants to step up to it. That's one of the big, to me, that's number one, challenge number one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of angles that we can look at this equity issue in terms of inputs and outputs. There's resources, the funding, the programs, the supplies, the tech available to each class, but also just the environments provided. Like we said, the physical structures, the facilities, the teaching staffs. So to get into the resource side of things, to start, remote learning was a key to continuing instruction during the pandemic. We have a lot of lessons learned from that in terms of access to tech and support for students that need to learn, that need to reach that learning curve. So my question here to the group is, how can schools kind of build on those experiences from the pandemic, further develop the use of technology in the classroom, and then also ensure that there are supports in place to make sure that there aren't any students that are being left behind in that area?
I'll jump in first just with a word of caution, which is I think that the pandemic showed us a lot of the limitations of technology. And from speaking to both teachers and students, there were certainly some students who really thrived in the remote environment, and there were certainly some benefits for some students who might have trouble focusing in the traditional classroom, or potentially had issues with behavior or bullying and other things. But for the most part, and the student achievement data is showing this as well, students really, I think the pandemic has really stamped for us the importance of that in-person student-teacher relationship, and student learning really suffered during remote instruction. And so I think that there are certainly, tools and strategies that were learned during the pandemic, but I would also really caution us to, as we look at some of our other challenges that we're facing, such as teacher shortages, just to say, well, technology and remote learning can solve these problems for us with no unintended consequences, because I think that we saw a lot of negative consequences and externalities from the time during remote learning.
I completely agree. On the one hand, the pandemic shined a big, bright spotlight on what we already knew. To Mr. Hardy's point about zip codes and how that influences and defines a lot of, quite frankly, defines the trajectory of too many of our young people, particularly Black and brown children. We also know that technology has an appropriate place. It can be used as well, let me go back. It shined a bright spotlight because of the sheer absence of the devices that so many kids had experienced, and the lack of internet access and so forth. And so I'm very pleased that in Philadelphia, Comcast and PHL Connected really stepped in to try to help to mitigate many of those problems here in the city. Fast forward, we're somewhere different in the pandemic. I don't know if we're exiting or just going to another phase of whatever we're in. But to your point, technology is a very important tool that we have to have tremendous amounts of professional learning for teachers and parents and students to know how these technologies can be used as a support tool to teachers, but they never ever should be designed to replace teachers, except for kids who learn in that particular modality. The training is so important because it's very easy for those devices and resources to become kind of the glorified worksheets, if you will. And so there's a lot of training in terms of how to keep kids engaged, how to make it rigorous, and not just to default public education as we know it to a computer or to some computer program. So I think your point is spot on there.
Well, I think that when I think about technology in schools, I think about this movie that I saw a couple of months ago, an old movie called The Apartment with Jack Lemmon, Charlie McClain. It was about a 1960s insurance company and all the stuff that went on in that insurance company. I tell you, if you look at that insurance company, which was a high-rise building with rows and rows of people sitting at desks, you can never find an insurance company that looks like that today. The insurance industry has been impacted by technology, and it looks different because of it. I would suggest to you that if you look at a movie about a school in 1960 and you walk into a lot of classrooms today, they look the same. There has not been the same impact of technology in schools that it has been in other sectors of work. What the opportunity that we had during this pandemic that we had with technology is that we could have education unbounded by time and location. I think that's a pretty big thing. You could do it anytime you want, and you could do it anywhere you want, okay? But we did not have the structures set up. We did not have the people set up to be able to pull that off. And I think that when we look back in years from now about what happened in the pandemic, I think that will be one of the big misses, that missed opportunities that we had here. If we don't start to make a deeper commitment to using technology in the educational process, our kids will always be behind. And the places where we complain the most about them not making any progress, they will always stay the same.
I could not agree with you more. That makes a lot of sense to me. I was superintendent in Rowe and Salisbury schools in North Carolina. It's the one district, it was the first K-12 school district in the state to implement a one-to-one device initiative in partnership with Apple. And what we learned is that our young people are 10 steps ahead of many of the adults, quite frankly, including many teachers. And so that's why I think professional learning is so important. When the pandemic hit us in March of 2020, there was a lot of educators who were ill-prepared to jump in and make maximum use of iPads, laptops, or whatever, Chromebooks, or whatever devices that were provided. Chromebooks here in the school district of Philadelphia. It has implications for how we teach differently. You know, that old British model of sitting in a row and sit up straight and just that didactic instruction where the teachers just ask you and the classrooms are quiet, those days are gone. New school construction should include flexible seating arrangements. Kids should be moving about. They should be interacting. Really, we shouldn't even be just focusing on a rote multiple choice test either, for that matter. We ought to be focusing on kids figuring out how to use what they learn to solve real world problems. To your point about that 24/7 learning and access to the internet, you're absolutely right. That's why I don't support banning cell phones in schools and things of that nature generally, because it's a mean to bring the libraries and the world to our fingertips. It also has implications, finally, for how we communicate with our students. Students, I've been doing a 100-day listening and learning tour here in Philadelphia, And I've heard from our students time and again that traditional email and Facebook and traditional face-to-face meeting structure is not quite the best way to engage them in communication. They tell me that they prefer TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. So to your point, we have to retool how we communicate with a lot of our students and younger people in schools and make use of the technology because it's here to stay, and it's a matter of how well we adapt to it. So I think you made some really good points there.
I would push back just a little bit that things haven't changed since the 50s or the 60s. I live here with my 3 grandkids. 2 of them are in college now. The other is starting high school tomorrow. And the 14-year-old has had experiences that even her older brother and sister have not had. So this public education system is constantly evolving.
Wow.
Not everywhere, not equally. That's the challenge that we have with this equity question. But the education experience they've had so far is far different than what their parents had, and nothing comparable to what I had. Or let me say, what I had was nothing comparable to the experiences they've had. So we ought to not let folks begin to think that nothing has changed, that all the problems have been unaddressed. I would agree completely that we have had many missed opportunities to take advantage of technology. Sir, I did a program down in Philadelphia with one of your predecessors and some folks from the museums there, probably 12 or 14 years ago. And I remember saying then, this internet thing was going to create tremendous opportunities. There's no reason why any kid in any school who is academically qualified can't take that Chinese course or the most advanced math or science course. They exist somewhere in this world. Somewhere there is access to it on the internet. And so there are opportunities to dramatically broaden the opportunities for kids in all of our districts, if only we have the leadership and we have the resources to make that happen. But today, kids can have friends who are in Kyoto, Japan, or Berlin, or pick any country in the world. They can see what's going on in those classrooms and compare for better or for worse. They've got opportunities to communicate with our astronauts who are on the space shuttle or the space station. So the opportunities that are there today are enormous and enormously different than in the past. The challenge is they're not equally available to all kids. And that's what we ought to be addressing.
I would say too that our educators, move mountains to adjust during the pandemic on the flip of a switch to teach virtually and learning. And many times I talk to educators and they talk about wanting professional development that is more responsive to what they're seeing in the classroom, both in terms of tech, in terms of social and emotional learning, in terms of class management. And they often are not getting professional development that is responsive to what they're seeing. They're seeing the same professional development offered by districts over and over again, and they want to see. So we have to also talk about how we're educating our educators and making sure that they're prepared for our students. And I would also like to take a step back. We've been talking about devices that are, one-to-one devices, but let's talk about the technology that are in our buildings for instance, our career and tech ed programs, like our pieces of larger equipment that our students are training on for nursing programs, for EMT programs, for whatever. Like, we have to talk about investing in those types of technologies in our buildings as well as the personal devices that our kids are getting and that they're being educated on. So I just want to take and talk about those technology needs as well.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Williams. That actually leads me into my next question. Along the lines of tech support, obviously access to it is just the first step. But like we mentioned, with professional development and students' unique needs when it comes to their ability to learn online, how do we have those extra resources available, whether it be for students to learn how to use a computer or how to learn in online instruction, or on the other hand, for teachers, how do they learn to keep up with these technologies that some students might, like you said, might know much better than they do?
Well, an industry standard, a gold standard in school districts is generally that we spend no less than 5% of our annual operating budget on meaningful professional development, and that professional development takes the face. That professional development includes, on the one hand, understanding the content standards that teachers teach relative to the curricula that teachers teach. The other side of that nickel, it relates to about pedagogy, because teaching is an art and a science. I can talk about it because I've been in a classroom as a teacher. So I don't beat teachers up. I try to figure out what do we need to do to help them to better be able to do both the content standards and then the pedagogy piece, which is a fancy way of saying how do we really engage students. And so it's not just the rote learning and what I understand Mr. Hardy to be referring to from that infamous movie from the 50s, where we were pretty much in straight rows, very didactic learning, very controlled, very linear, versus being this open space where there's a back and forth communication between the student and the teacher. The teacher is less of a lecturer and more, if you will, and more of a facilitator of learning. And so we just have to recognize that a lot of young people are going to be further ahead of us, and that's okay. But we have to have good professional development and support systems to help teachers and other paraprofessionals in the schools understand the value of the technology. And then we have to evaluate the extent to which we're using the technology and how the technologies are helping us to improve the bottom line outcome of improving student achievement.
Well, Teach Plus is a teacher leadership organization, so we very strongly believe in the power of teacher voice and teacher leadership. Some of our programs, including one of our partnerships with the School District of Philadelphia, really focus on supporting teacher leaders to be a part of school-wide decision-making and leading the professional learning of their peers. And so I do believe, like Dr. Watlington said, that professional learning, having the time and the space and the structures is important, but also having the buy-in and the participation of teachers in identifying the topics, as Senator Williams mentioned, and actually being a part of the facilitation. So we support teacher leaders who are leading professional learning communities or grade teams of their peers and using that time to analyze student work and student data, do really intentional intellectual preparation and learning around new skills and around deepening their content knowledge and familiarity with curriculum. And I do believe that any type of changes and improvements we want to see to our education system, we need to be taking a systems thinking approach, but also a human-centered design approach where we are thinking about the perspectives of those closest to the system, which is our students, our parents, and our teachers.
Now, do we need to innovate and do a lot of things very differently? Absolutely. Now, I wouldn't say that I see classrooms across the school district of Philadelphia that looks like a replica of 1950. If Rip Van Winkle went to sleep and woke up, he'd see the exact same thing. But to your point, Mr. Hardy, I do think that, we're having that conversation every day in schools about, why is it that Blockbuster and BlackBerry are no longer around, and that the Kodak camera processing stuff is no longer around. It's because they didn't innovate. They didn't change. They didn't meet the market demands in changing times. Do public school districts and the School District of Philadelphia need to do that? Absolutely. But I want to give us credit in the places where people are working really hard to do that. So I think part of what we struggle with is this perception issue. When you ask Americans anywhere, according to the Gallup poll, what do you think about the public schools? And people kind of will rank them kind of here. What do you think about your child's teacher? Much higher. So that tells me that we have to do a better job sometimes of telling our story. And we also have to work harder at getting better outcomes, because outputs at the end of the day matter, but I think it's a combination of doing both.
I think that's a good point about outcomes. That brings us back to our earlier discussion as well. We want to be able to have performance metrics in place, to have those types of quantitative and qualitative data that we can analyze to see what is effective and what is not within the classroom. Does anybody have any thoughts on that topic?
Well, again, there's data on that kind of stuff. There's a gentleman who works at Drexel University, professor at Drexel University, who did a deep dive on the class of 2006 from Philadelphia, both public and charter school graduates. And he followed them out the 7 years after they graduated to see how many finished, how many completed college, how many went to college, that type of thing. We live in a TikTok world where it's great to show on TikTok that 100% of the class got accepted to college. Everybody likes to throw that one out there. But we don't talk about how many of those same kids actually went to college, and for God's sakes, how many of them actually finished college. When the Drexel professor did that type of calculation for Black males in Philadelphia, there was an 8% four-year college completion rate, not attendance rate, not who money went, it's who completed. Of all the people who went, only 8% completed. That is the equity problem right there. And if we don't fix that kind of stuff, we'll be sitting here again 10 years, 20 years, or somebody will, not me, but people will be sitting here a long time from now having the same conversations.
I totally agree. We don't need to hide from it. We need to put the brutal facts on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the National Clearinghouse gives us persistence data. I think is a very fair assessment of public traditional schools, to include the traditional and charter schools, to not only share the data related to graduation rate, four-year graduation rates and dropout rates in the high schools, but also to use that clearinghouse data to say, in year two, what's the persistence rate, who's still in college and progressing and making proficient or higher marks in their courses, and to break that down by race, ethnicity, and gender. I absolutely think that's a legitimate thing we need to do. Then when we do that, I want us to also talk about why is it that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the number of individuals who are choosing to go into public and private institutions in this very fine state is down by 67%. And I think we have to all own that and wrap our brains around that, and try to change some of the narrative about what we think about the prospect and potential of public schools in this country that, quite frankly, created the middle class in this country, and that also helped the United States to develop the world's largest economy. All of that is at risk. To your point, sir, you're absolutely right, if we don't interrupt these systems that lead to the kind of numbers that you just referenced.
And building on that, I mean, we focused here in the K-12 space so far, but that leads into what we're doing in higher ed. How are we investing in our public schools in higher ed? Are we turning out educators? Are we turning out Black and brown educators? Are we making sure that our students who are going to college are successful? And if you look at the statistics there, the increases in tuition at our state schools, there's a direct correlation to our Black and brown populations in those schools and whether or not they're staying in because of the affordability factor. So if we're not talking about the fact that Pennsylvania is one of the worst in the countries in the terms of how we invest in higher education and has one of the highest student debt levels in the country, we're not going to address that piece of it either.
There was a drive task force appointed by North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, and had a professor from Winston-Salem State, the provost at Winston-Salem State University, to chair that task force. And one of the biggest deterrents that drive task force said was to recruiting more Black males and Black females, particularly Black males, into the teaching profession to go to public and private institutions was the ability to graduate with a degree debt-free. If we could figure out a way to get more people to graduate debt-free, the data showed that we could move the needle on increasing our teacher diversity pipeline. I know we've got a number of initiatives that have been launched here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to try to help us recruit more teachers outside of the state. And so we're very appreciative of all of that work, Senator Williams.
On that point, if I could just add, since we're getting into a little bit of discussion about policy, these issues, in this case, around teacher recruiting, retention, et cetera, to a significant extent, I believe, they have been driven by public policy, whether it's been good policy or bad policy. These issues, whether these broader issues about inequity, it was during the Rendell administration, a long time before COVID, that the U.S. Secretary of Education said we had the worst system in the country in terms of the gap between the have and have-not districts and the opportunities for kids in those respective districts. This issue of teacher shortage was predictable and was beginning to happen before there was ever COVID. But we've done some things in Pennsylvania. The senator pointed out it's costly. You get into a lot of debt on average to get a higher education and get that teacher degree in Pennsylvania. That's been an impediment. We changed the pension system, so it's less lucrative now for young people who are thinking about where I'm going to have a career. But we have been disrespectful for teachers. The secretary preceding this session talked about the initiative of the Department of Education. But I would ask, is that going to be sustainable? They've got a plan for now through 2025 or so. But in 6 months, we're going to have a new governor. And one of those candidates is talking about cutting money for higher education and for basic education. But we're going to have a new governor and new leadership of the Department of Education. So these good ideas that are in place, are they sustainable? I was just looking at my phone here to recall an email that I got yesterday from the U.S. Department of Ed. They announced a scholarship program and an initiative around diversity, program named after a former representative. They created the program in 2008, but only this summer did they fund that program, 14 years later. So it doesn't count so much to have lots of good ideas and announce initiatives. The question is, can you sustain it over time across administrations, across the Department of Education leadership? And we haven't done well by those measures here in Pennsylvania.
Well, I started a teacher training program here at Boyce, and I tried to encourage alumni who had graduated from college and hadn't decided what they wanted to do to come back here into a residency program, kind of learn about, become an apprentice, and then a teaching resident where you could teach classes here and go get certified at Drexel University. And one of the things I found is like was said earlier, there's an economic piece to this, that you have to show these guys that they're not going to go broke trying to be a teacher, because you can do that too. There's people who have certification programs for their employees where it costs their employees $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 to get certified, and they have a poorly paying job. And that, it just doesn't make sense. We have to make the whole economic thing make sense. The other thing we have to do is specifically target for the people that we know we need. If we want Black men, we have to target Black men or Latino men. We have to make them interested in teaching. One of the things that I was a little disappointed in myself about is that from the very first year at Boyce Latin, we've had a career day, okay? And when we started the teaching fellowship in 2020, one thing I realized is we never invited teachers to come in our career day. Now, what does that say about us? I mean, I was a little embarrassed about that. But the fact of the matter is that way we do go overboard trying to introduce our children to all kinds of, exotic careers. And we miss one that's sitting right in front of them every day that's been helping them every day of their lives. And I think we need to be a little more aggressive in trying to sell this profession. This is a good profession.
Absolutely.
You'll love this.
Well, there are a couple other things too related to policy, and maybe a later panel today is going to have a chance to delve into this a little deeper. But one, we've got a minimum teacher salary by law in Pennsylvania of $18,500. My grandkids can make more money than that working at Sheets, with a high school diploma or less. So not many districts are starting at 18.5. I think there might still be one out there. Most of them are much better. But for a young person who's thinking about a career, you read the starting salary is 18.5. And then sometimes it's the emotional result of, or the emotional impact of reading every spring. The teachers are getting furloughed, or they're not sure how much money they're going to get from the state until July, and districts have to do their budget in May and June. Or, final point, this spring, I should say, I spoke to a group of future teachers at one of our universities. And a young woman asked me, are they going to make me carry a gun? We've got that kind of policy discussion that is creating impact and images for these students, these young people who are thinking about, do I want to have a career in teaching? So we got to get smarter about our public policies and our public statements.
I'd love to jump in after that. It seems like we've kind of gotten into the topic of teacher shortages, which is one of the ones that's been keeping me up at night. I want to really echo the statements of many others that I think that it's really important, and I've shared this with Secretary Haggerty as well, that Pennsylvania works towards setting an explicit goal of making it free to become a teacher in Pennsylvania, which is something that our colleagues in Tennessee are working towards, and I think is one piece of that cost benefit equation as we think about our students, particularly those who can't afford to take on a lot of debt or are going to have to take out student loans as they're deciding what career to pursue. Obviously, the pay on the other end is also important. And as Ron mentioned, there's a lot of other things that are impacting teacher working conditions and that our students are seeing as they're going to school and then considering, do I want to try my teacher's job? Or even hearing from their teachers, don't go into this profession, that we need to consider. And some of it is coming from the political environment. I mean, to add on, in addition to this question about guns, teachers are currently being accused by some politicians of being groomers or indoctrinators, or, otherwise being told that they're, basically trying to do evil things to children. That certainly doesn't help morale when you're also underpaid. But then also there are conditions within the school. And I know, Dr. Watlington, I'm sure you've looked at this data. When you look at the School District of Philadelphia's exit data for teachers who are leaving the classroom and saying why, one of the top most frequent reasons in Philadelphia and in most other school districts is something related to the principal. And so there's obviously some work needs to be done in terms of training of our principals and making sure that we're thinking at the school level about how we value teachers, whether they feel respected as professionals and that they have a say in what's going on. I'll just make a quick plug that Teach Plus is going to be hosting a PA Needs Teachers Summit in September to really convene a lot of stakeholders to think about, in a holistic and very systemic way, how do we make teaching a profession that is one that attracts our best and brightest and makes them want to stay. And so we're looking forward to continuing that conversation. But as Ron said, there are a lot of policy barriers or policy steps we could take to address this issue.
I think I'm glad you mentioned that. The research literature tells us that for teachers in particular, it's not only about money. I caution people when they say people don't go into teaching to get rich, or people don't go into teaching for the money. They do go into teaching, they make a fair, hard-earned salary. I'll say that as a teacher at heart and as a superintendent. But to your point, it's one factor. We know the research, there's a lot of research that tells us that a lot of times teachers will leave their immediate supervisor. And so that working relationship culture matters, work culture matters. And so we're really paying attention to that in terms of the run up to developing a district strategic plan later this fall, or beginning that process. The second thing I'll mention is I'd ask us to think about in the free market, in a capitalist free market economy, which I'm a supporter of directly, where else does supply decrease by 67% or by 50% nationally? And I can't recall that exact number you referenced, Mr. Cowell, but I think it was 18,500 or something like that. Where else does the supply reduce so significantly and the demand not increase appreciably to have an appreciable impact on salaries? It says something about what we value. And I just think that in all our discussions, we have to look, we've got to do a better job of improving our outputs, no question about it. Signature among that, according to the research, is I would argue, Mr. Hardy, that where kids live and their zip codes has an impact on their life chances and outcomes, not just generically, but also in terms of how they experience highly qualified, well-supported, and stable teachers over time. And so it's about the teacher, according to the research. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention about what's happening in the United States of America, what's happening in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and certainly what's happening in the city of Philadelphia as one of the nation's prime cities.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the market before, that, you know, if you see these changes in the market and there's no reaction to it, you know, you got to wonder what's going on. Here's another thing that the market has to understand is that when you have schools, school systems set up where you have a teacher pay scale where everybody gets paid the same, that does something to the quality of candidates too. I mean, I always use the example of there was a guy in a suburban school district here who was a business teacher, and he made I think it was like $130,000 a year. And my question was, could he make that money if he went out to the business world, or were any of the people that he taught going to be able to make that kind of money? And I thought the answer was no. But the response I got was that he worked there a certain number of years. That means he should get that money. That's the only place that happens is in a school. That's not the way the world works. We need to change the way we're organized to be more market driven so we can get more people into this profession and attract them with the things that other people attract people into a industry with.
I'd like to go back to what Laura said about supporting educators. And one of the things I think we haven't talked about yet today is mental health supports in our schools, both for our educators and our students. That is the number one thing I hear about every time I'm in a school talking to educators, talking to students, and making sure that we have more mental health professionals in the school, counselors, therapists, social workers, school nurses, etc. The whole complement that makes classroom management easier on the educator, makes it easier for the student to show up and be able to learn. Like, those are things that we need to do. We got a small piece in the budget with my bill with Senator Brooks, was, a bill for a mental health grant to incentivize mental health professionals to help pay for their internships in school and take some of that student debt on. But if we're talking about helping to keep educators in the profession, another piece that we haven't talked about is the mental health supports that will help them and our students.
And Senator Williams, those of us in school districts are so appreciative for your leadership in that regard, and Senator Brooks. I've talked to countless number of young people here in Philadelphia this summer as a part of a listening and learning tour. And they've told me to a person that they are experiencing a heightened sense of anxiety, a heightened sense of depression, feelings of disconnectedness from their peers, and they're pulling more inward and desperately want to have a quote unquote normal school year this year. And we've looked at data that shows us that there's a significant uptick in the number of individuals who've placed calls to suicide prevention hotlines and things of that nature. And so I've also heard from our young people that our counselor to student ratio is too large. And so the things that you guys are doing in the legislature to try to equip us with more resources and supports, please know that we're being good stewards of those resources. Thanks. And we're trying to not just say we've got to have 1,000 more counselors. Could we use them? Absolutely. We're not marching up to Harrisburg tomorrow asking you to send them down the next day. We're looking at how we can help prepare a lot more individuals, teachers, paraprofessionals, support staff, to have some understanding of trauma-informed care and how all of us can work together to wrap our arms around our young people who've experienced a lot of trauma during the pandemic, not to mention some issues of gun violence, et cetera, particularly in our city. And so I just want you to know that we're going to continue to work really hard and be good stewards of the dollars that we have. And we certainly want to continue to have partnership support.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you on it. It's a priority of mine, and it's just so important. We have so much work to do in that space.
Thank you.
Thanks,
and
everybody.
just to add, Senator Williams, I'm glad that part of your package was the loan forgiveness piece for those mental health professionals, because all of the things we just talked about in terms of barriers to entry for teachers are also true of those mental health professionals. And while we need more of them in schools, we also don't have enough of them. So we have to be thinking about how to break down those barriers and recruit more of them as well.
And it speaks to how we integrate our services with the public school district, with mental health professionals in the community. Children's First, a group here in Philadelphia, facilitated a panel discussion in our district about this. And it gave us an opportunity to reflect on the extent to which we really we connect our supports and resources. It's very easy in a large organization to have that silo effect. And so we're really trying to really make sure to break down all those walls to the extent that they exist in some places.
Senator, you might already be a part of it, but I'd remind everybody that there are some important activities in the Department of Education around trauma-informed education as well. And that's another good resource for folks who are looking for some guidance or assistance on those issues.
Let's also remember the needs of our teachers and some of our school staffs who've experienced trauma themselves and been trying to did their very best in many cases to teach other families and children and take care of their own families. Many have some other issues they're addressing too. So we want to make sure that both our students and our staffs are not just physically safe and well, but emotionally and socially healthy and well. This, as we run up to the school year and the start of school on 29 August.
Thanks, everybody. Apologies first for interrupting this great discussion. I didn't want to step into your way. And secondly, if you hear any background noise, for some reason, PGW thought this was a good time to start drilling outside my office. But to move on to the next section, looking a lot towards, like you said, teacher development or career development. We want to create a healthy and safe environment for students to either become career ready, college ready, whatever path they may choose. So in those terms, how do we restructure instruction and classroom work to, maybe introduce life skills, trade skills, anything along those lines to meet more students' unique needs?
Well, I think on the one hand, it has implications for how we evaluate our work. In North Carolina, I was the superintendent of the only renewal school district. And we quite frankly were working on designing an alternate school and district accountability model that gave test scores a place. We were also focused on the extent to which we get rated on how specifically and explicitly we teach interpersonal and the soft skills that too many of our employers say that our young people still need more development with. And then the extent to which we get them into appropriate apprenticeship opportunities and other shovel-ready work and industry credentialing opportunities. That's one. So I say it has implications for how we use multiple measures to evaluate schools and districts, to include academic performance, because we don't need to hide from that, because the brutal fact is that we need to get better. It also has implications in a post-pandemic period for how we structure the school year and the curriculum. I continue to ask myself, is there anything sacred about a 180-day school year or 900 instructional hours? My sense is we ought to think about moving kids along once they master the standards and not warehouse everybody into an artificial beginning and end point. So innovative thinking post-pandemic makes me think about competency-based education, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about it here, but I just want to throw that out for our consideration.
I would take that also up to the higher education. We kind of force everybody to go through higher education in this 4-year cycle. You know, I had a teacher here who went to college. It took him 10 years to get a degree, but he was 28 years old. He became a teacher. He's got 30, 40 years of teaching in front of him. There's no reason for kids to rack up all this debt if they could take a more relaxed path through college. Some kids can benefit from that, but we don't encourage that, and I think we should. The other thing I think we should do is that in the Clearinghouse, we only look out 6 years. I think we should look out 10 years. I think that's a reasonable amount of time for a young person to get a degree and move on to a professional career. And I think we should know how that affects things. And so if we had more data like that, I think we would see a different outcome.
I also just want to talk about the role of career and technical education and dual enrollment as just two ways of trying to blur that distinction between the K-12 system and the world of both higher education and work. You know, we've got good research that shows us that students who participate in dual enrollment in high school, which is the opportunity to take college level courses for both high school and college credit, usually for free. So you're also reducing that cost of college. That is a tool that makes them more likely to then attend and graduate from college. It reduces racial achievement gaps. And oftentimes, particularly in this time of staffing shortage, it's something that can address challenges around staffing at the high school level as well, because you're able to use some of those per pupil funds to partner with community colleges and institutions of higher ed. And then, you know, there's a lot of great CTE programs, and I think it probably could be a great demand for even more. I think overall, and this is as a high school teacher, as my first teaching job, I think we don't think enough and talk with students enough at the high school level and even earlier about, you know, what do you see as your purpose in life? What are you good at? What brings you joy? What is, you know, that particular thing that brings together your gifts and the world's needs? And I think if we were really able to design our you know, educational experiences at the high school level a little bit more around the answers to those questions, we would see increases in student engagement and attendance and, you know, measures of sort of motivation, as well as improved outcomes, as David Harvey is talking about, because we're bringing together that supply and the demand, right? We're bridging the gap between the education and the economy and helping our students actually figure out what they want to do and start working towards that, rather than having high school feel like just a time they got to get through before they answer that question.
No, it gives them a reason for being there every day. A lot of kids don't really have a reason to be there. We need to give them a reason to be there. We need to show them that there's a future out there and that you need to be thinking about that. And we should be preparing you all the way through. Kids who don't have that connection don't do well in school. That shouldn't be a surprise.
Agreed.
There's a question in the chat box, and I'm not going to try to answer it, but I would hope that our sponsors or our hosts would link up Mr. Harrell from the Master Builders Association of Western PA with maybe Lee Burkett in the Department of Education. She's in charge of the Bureau of Career and Tech Ed. He raises an important question and suggestion, which is a reminder about the Career Tech Ed issue. It's another manifestation of inequity across our 500 school districts. We've got some great career tech programs, great career tech opportunities. Some of them are in the standalone centers. Some of them are in the school districts themselves. But the opportunities for kids across the spectrum, or even young adults, to enroll in the career tech programs is uneven. That's being kind about it. Some school districts, because of money, and that's the reason, because of money, they've limited access for their students to career tech programs. They have a quota in terms of a limit, in terms of the number of students that they'll send to the Career Tech Center. There are centers across the state. Some of them have long waiting lists, but others have big vacancies. So we ought to be taking a closer look. Important things have been done by the Department of Ed, and I want to take away from those initiatives. The legislature started to put a little bit more money into career tech ed, but our Department of Labor and Industry said we had more than 40,000 skilled positions, workforce opportunities that were going unmet across the state. We've got a worker shortage in many respects. In many industries, they're looking for workers, but we need to direct kids, not necessarily to college, as some of you have suggested, but to get them into these very effective career tech programs that, again, are unevenly presented in terms of opportunity across the state.
I think we ought to have, and we certainly want to do that here in the School District of Philadelphia, and I think we ought to be doing it across the Commonwealth. On the one end, we ought to be increasing the number of engineers in the state. We ought to be increasing the number of people who become teachers. We also ought to invest heavily in career technical education. In the school district where I served in North Carolina, while we were not the largest district in the state, out of 115 school districts, we were ranked number 4 in the state in terms of the sheer number of students who graduated from high school with a career and technical education concentrator pathway, which means they took certain courses that were well planned and organized toward the goal of them getting an industry certification of some time and could walk into some good paying jobs. And this was a low wealth school district. And so I think it's a matter of prioritizing lots of different pathways for kids, giving kids more options, putting the resources and doing some really thoughtful planning, and again, prioritizing some of these areas that can be really life-changing opportunities for a lot of our kids, a lot of our young people.
Great. We have just a few minutes left on this panel, so I wanted to get to a last question. Before getting to it, just wanted to thank Senator Lindsey Williams again. She had to head out just a few minutes early. But before we wrap up, just one more question for the panel here, and this is kind of trying to encompass much of the discussion here today. Given that every school and every district has different needs, every student may need special instruction, special supports, how do we gear our education policy to better accommodate the needs of individual schools and districts while still maintaining those levels of accountability and transparency?
As people think about that question, if I might just go back one moment and I want to highlight an exemplar in the school district of Philadelphia, if I could take a point of privilege to do that. There's a middle college high school here based on the community college of Philadelphia's campus. And I can tell you, when I talk to those young people as early as ninth grade, they came in before the school year started, and they are working really hard in this to do a lot of the work that we're doing. So I do want to just highlight there are some exemplars. We should identify those exemplars that are working well in the public space. And then I think it's important for us to figure out ways to grow and replicate those successful initiatives.
I think there's exemplars both within and without the public space, and we need to look at all of them because I think they're both helpful.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree. I can only speak to the public because that's what I'm spent my career in. That's what I know. But I think there's more than one way to do it. Absolutely. Good point.
Thank you.
If I might add,
how do we try to balance that fine line there, policy wise?
well, one of the things we need to resist in state capitals around the country, including Harrisburg, is for policymakers to tell teachers how to teach. It's appropriate that we be clear from a policy standpoint about what we want them to teach, what we want the outcomes to be. I mean, we've gone through this debate for the last 25 years or more. So be clear about what our expectations are of the system, but resist the temptation to tell teachers how to teach. We tend to have a lot of, well, somebody wrote the other day, everybody's been to school. So far too many people think they know how to teach because they were in school. That's a special profession. So that's one thing. Don't have state policy get in the way of effective teaching and effective programs. Secondly, we got to make sure that some of the initiatives are sustainable. I mean, this year, the legislature deserves a lot of credit. Governor Wolf deserves a lot of credit for an unprecedented infusion of state dollars into the public education system. Question is that going to be sustainable? We've had other times over the last 30, 40 years when 1 year, maybe even 2 years, there was a significant infusion. And then the next year, $854 million was taken away from school districts. That was in 2011. So we can't have that erratic support. We can't have that unpredictability of support. And then finally, on the issues of teacher recruiting and retention, we need public policies that are going to smartly address those issues. There's a host of ideas that the Department of Ed has put forward. Folks like Laura have been in the forefront with a lot of these initiatives and others on this program. But we need to make sure that stuff is sustainable, that it's well funded, and that the young person who is in high school today, or maybe a freshman or sophomore in college, can have some confidence that the incentives or the supports are actually going to be there when they graduate and begin to enter the profession.
I'll just say quickly to echo a little bit from Ron. I think there's a lot that our policymakers can do, a lot that they should probably steer clear of. I think a great first step is ensuring that schools and districts have the resources in an equitable manner to provide student supports, keeping in mind what has been shared by Dr. Watlington, that we know that the most important factor is that teacher quality. So particularly, I'd love to see our policymakers allocating resources to support recruitment and retention of teachers in terms of pay, reducing costs of college, and addressing different pieces around working conditions.
I'll just say let's continue a lot of the positive steps that are occurring in the Commonwealth as a newcomer to the Commonwealth. That includes Senator Hughes' bill in the budget that has funded the Teacher Recruitment, Retention, and Diversity Bill, and Senator Bartolotta's Reciprocity Bill. Both became law. It makes it easier for teachers who are in other states to get here. I think that I certainly hope the legislature will consider supporting Representative Schlossberg's bill that would provide the districts with financial support to fund these local educator pathways, and Representative Young's bill that will provide support to educators to pay off loans. I believe President Biden is supposed to be making some kind of announcement from Washington later this week. I saw somewhere earlier this morning. I certainly hope that traction that's in the in our legislature now will get some serious attention as well. It will do nothing but help us recruit, retain, develop great teachers.
Yeah, it's just about that time. I would love for this discussion to keep going. It's been very insightful. We want to just thank again all the panelists individually, Ron Cowell, Dr. Watlinger, Senator Williams, Mr. Hardy, and Ms. Boyce. Great discussion on reimagining equitable education in a post-pandemic world. Before we turn things over, next thing I do need to turn things over back to our MC, Greg Salisbury. And thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Thank you. Harris, thank you so much, panelists. Thank you so much for a great informative panel. Our next panel will highlight higher education and meeting the challenges of workforce development. This panel will be moderated by Jenny DeHuff. She's the editor-in-chief of City and State Pennsylvania. Jenny?
Hi, Greg. Thanks so much for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I will start by introducing our panelists. With us this afternoon, we have Dr. Charles Pattison, president of Shippensburg University, State Senator Judy Schwenk, minority chair of the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee and a member of the PASHE Board of Governors, and Dr. Rebecca L. Watts, the Northeast Regional Vice President for Western Governors University. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, all three of you. I guess what I'll start is giving you a description of the panel and what we're going to discuss this afternoon. Here's our challenge today. Accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, college enrollment in Pennsylvania continues to decline as state schools face an ever-increasing competitive landscape for students. At the same time, Pennsylvania employers need to fill gaps in the workforce. But the population of traditional college students isn't large enough to meet that need. Declining enrollment has been a major issue for Pennsylvania schools. But now that Pennsylvania's state universities have received an historic funding increase, the next phase of the state's system redesign is underway. Before we jump into the questions, let's begin by going over some statistics. Let me put this to the group. Can anyone speak to some college enrollment trends since the pandemic? I know we've seen a decline, but I'm not sure exactly by how much.
I can speak to some of that, if you will, Jenny.
Thanks.
If you look at the global enrollment in higher education across the country, enrollment declines have continued to worsen. Total post-secondary enrollment fell about 16.2 million in the spring, marking a one-year decline of about 4.1%, or 685,000 students across the United States. Enrollments declined in the spring at both undergraduate and graduate levels, and this is following a 3.5% drop last spring, whereby post-secondary institutions lost nearly about 1.3 million students since the spring of 2020. And undergraduate enrollment accounted for most of the decline, dropping about 4.7%, to your point. So public institutions suffered the brunt of the enrollment declines this particular spring, losing about 600,000 students, or about 5% from a year ago. As we look at 2022-23 enrollments, however, we're seeing some good information coming forward based on some very preliminary data. Many of our institutions are expecting to have first-year classes. This is kind of first time in college students that are larger than last year. It's just over half. And in fall of 2022, new students, both first time and transfers, were down prior. So the preliminary data that we're seeing is many of our enrollments for first time in college students are starting to stabilize. But those enrollment declines are going to have a lasting impact on the overall enrollment at our institutions. It will also impact the number of degrees our institutions might confer for many years, thus perhaps exacerbating some of the labor challenges.
Does anybody want to spin off that, or shall I move on?
I'll only add, as Dr. Patterson knows, in our PASHE board meetings, as we discuss the trends as we're looking at system redesign, that this trend, there's a long-term issue here, and we need to look differently in terms of who our students are. Traditionally, we're looking at, right out of high school, 18-year-old, and, slightly higher ages. We're not making enough 18-year-olds anymore. So we've really got to start looking at a different way, a different model in terms of our role in educating that workforce. Not just to sustain ourselves, I think that's really important to mention, but to make sure that we fulfill the mission that PASHE has to the Commonwealth and to our taxpayers and our students. We've got to deliver some value there for them.
I would say that as a nonprofit, non-public institution, what we've seen at Western Governors University since the pandemic is we've had continued enrollment growth, but the pace slowed. So the growth hasn't been as exponential as it was prior to that. Importantly, when we talk about the opportunities, educational opportunities that are available in the Commonwealth, and the continued decrease of 18-year-olds, we have to look to the working adult and figure out how we can continue to support their ongoing growth and professional development. Some who started in college and then went into the workforce and never finished, others who are in the workforce but need to upskill. So I would say that importantly, when I talk about WGU's enrollment, our average student age is 34. So that is a significant difference than what than historically what we've talked about, again, has been referenced, is that traditional just emerging from high school student.
Yeah. Dr. Watts, I want to circle back to that more specific point about what we see over time historically in terms of enrollment. But let me just toss out to you like a blanket question to get this panel rolling that you can probably all speak to. And that is how higher education is adapting in general to meet the changing needs of employers and students.
We have to listen to students and what they need. We have to listen to employers and what they need in terms of talent. So it was referenced in the earlier panel today that we need to make colleges student ready. I think it was Secretary Haggerty that said we must make colleges student ready. And then also what colleges and universities must do is to make sure that when we graduate students or move them through a program, that they are work ready, that they're career ready, that they're getting the skills, knowledge, and expertise that are needed to be able to get into a thriving wage career and progress so that they can bring a happy, healthy, thriving household to their families, but also to lift up our communities and the Commonwealth in general.
Yeah. In some of the ways that we're doing that within higher education, we're really working with students on the skills needed to transition from college into the workplace, assisting with skills on resumes, cover letters, interviews, looking at the development and communication that will aid in the transition from the classroom to employment, creating customized internship experiences that incorporate employability skills and development with traditional work experiences. We're really redefining the framework of university industry partnerships by creating these open lines of communication from both partners, the university and the industry, and developing continuous feedback loops so that we can engage employers in sessions that incorporate students in these sessions, that incorporate faculty and staff and the employer, designed to facilitate discussions about their needs instead of the university just trying to tell employers what they can provide. It's a two-way street. And through that, we're developing certificate, non-degree credentials, in addition to traditional academic programs that support the needs of in-demand industries and high-priority occupations. In Pennsylvania, for example, the state system leads an early childhood education professional development organization. While it's based out of SHIP, it is across the system, and it creates an apprenticeship model that supports employees in entry-level positions, creates socioeconomic mobility, and provides pathways into academic programs that can further enhance their careers.
I think we as institutions need to be more entrepreneurial. We need to be more out there in terms of relating to what employers are looking for, what students are looking for, most certainly having a better understanding of where our critical workforce needs are, and taking that long look, but also delivering just in time. Just like our manufacturers and our businesses in the Commonwealth have had to adjust to supply chain issues or a new world in terms of what customers want. We as institutions have to do the same thing. It's not an easy thing to do either. It all sounds real good, but it's a lot of consistent and constant effort to stay in touch with what the needs in the workforce are. And in terms of the Commonwealth, it varies across the Commonwealth. There are big overall categories, like Dr. Patterson just talked about childcare workers. We've got to get them better paid too, right, Dr. Patterson, so that they want to participate in these types of opportunities. But also looking at healthcare in general. In the earlier panel, we talked about education. Engineering is another, at least locally for us, in the community that I serve, an area that employers are looking for more employees. Let them help design what the curriculum looks like as well, rather than just saying, here's our product, here's what we can offer you, take it or leave it. And I think we've done way too much of that.
That's right. And you're going to see more investment by those industries into higher education, either through philanthropic efforts, investments, and scholarships to help build those programs so that we're creating a better prepared workforce.
I would like to just call out, because it was brought up in the earlier panel, Superintendent Watlington called out competency-based education. And that is where each student progresses at her or his own pace after they demonstrate that mastery. That is the model that Western Governors University uses. And it's essential for us to, when we were founded 25 years ago, that's how we started, and we've been that way. And it's a very different model, and it's hard for a traditional model institution to shift to that because of the individual attention that's required for each student. But it's essential for the working adult to be able to have that, because life is a part of all of the learning of an adult worker. And so being able to fit that self-paced component into it is really essential as we think about how higher ed responds to the needs that we see in 2022 and beyond.
Well, now you've got me curious. Let's stay with you for a moment, Dr. Watts. Because I was going to ask Senator Schwenk the same question, but having an older population, as you do in your school, right? Most of the students are a little bit of non-traditional. What are some of the pain points you see, or some of the challenges that you think they see when trying to reach a certain goal, or even if it's just graduation amongst that population?
A big pain point is access. Mm-hmm. And they may be working full-time, but not in a thriving wage career, or not where they want to get in their career, but they can't walk away from their work to go to school. And so sometimes it's geographic access. Sometimes it's just the access of time and space. And sometimes it's a cost or their ability to pay for that. And for many people, it's all three of those. And so in a competency-based model like WGU provides, there is no time and space barrier, because every student learns at the time of day. They take their tests at the time. If you want to take a test at 2 a.m., there's a proctor ready to proctor that exam for you. Our faculty, we have a differentiated faculty model where each student has a faculty mentor that is their one-on-one mentor. That's different from the course instructors. And the course instructors have on-demand office hours tutoring sessions with each individual student. And we require them to work some evenings and we require them to work some weekend days. So it's understanding the access issues that adult learners face and providing a model that removes those barriers to a great extent.
You mentioned access, particularly among, I imagine, those who are historically underrepresented communities such as first-generation college students, low-income populations, people of color, and I think you said working adults. What can be done to improve in this area?
I'm going to jump back to the prior panel and I'm going to talk about how each of us need to see somebody in front of us that has achieved what we would like to achieve. So it's making sure that even in K-12, our education workforce is diversified. It's so that we are making connections in communities that have historically been underrepresented to inspire and to identify ways around sometimes perceived barriers, sometimes real barriers. We have to be able to show people, they have to be able to envision what that path can be. And for so many historically underrepresented communities and individuals, it's too hard to see that. We have to lift up visibility for what is possible for every person and help them see the ways that they can move down that path to success.
Can I add to that?
Please.
I think it's important, again, going back to that prior panel, we shouldn't separate K through 12 from higher education in terms of looking at the entire universe of education. We as legislators certainly should not, at least that's what I think. But I think the idea is to inculcate in elementary school, maybe a little bit earlier, in terms of helping students to understand the value of education, of lifelong learning, that there's not an endpoint necessarily to your education and what you'll need to learn as you progress throughout your life. That as you know, we look at the careers that are available. Certainly, it's about career training as well. But if we want to increase access, then we have to help students and their parents, by the way, understand how important learning is. I had a conversation with a woman in her mid-career who is a publisher of a Latino magazine, and she talked about the fact that she couldn't afford education. So she's doing this and learning as she goes. But she instilled in her kids the idea of it's not an option. Higher education, whether it's college or it's some other learning opportunity, would be part of their lives. And she recognized that this was something good that she had done. We need more parents to do that, but we need to help people understand that. And affordability, of course, will be an important part of this. We've gotten away a little bit from the value proposition. And in this economy, people are going back to that. They're understanding that they want to see, what will higher education get me? No matter what point in their lives they enter into it. We've got to deliver.
Yeah, I think in the comments of Senator Schwank and Dr. Watts, you hear expressed that higher education has been for a while, and now as we move further forward, is creating career and education ladders that communicate to adults. They communicate a pathway through education and career that can meet the lifestyle needs of the student, of the employee, while also improving their socioeconomic mobility. Once we infuse the value proposition back into that, and making it affordable as well, is going to be key, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Absolutely. So I want to get to you as well, more specifically in your line of work, Dr. Patterson, but what are you seeing, Senator Schwank, in your district? The most significant issues discussing in declining enrollment in Pennsylvania colleges. What are you seeing in your district among your constituents who are trying to go to college but either can't afford it or are encountering some other hindrance?
That's an interesting question when you look at the district that I represent, which includes the city of Reading and the school district of Reading, which is the second largest school district behind Philadelphia in the Commonwealth, and a 70% Latino population. So it's a very diverse community, a very entrepreneurial and upwardly mobile community, and oftentimes a community that never would have conceived that there's a possibility of higher education or that there's anything in it for them. One of the things, there certainly are the career pathways. There's no shortage of programs, whether it's through Kutztown University or Pashy School, which is in my district, or the other 3 or 4 institutions like Alvernia University or Albright College and Reading Area Community College. There are no shortage of opportunities and programs that these institutions are offering to help people understand how this could be an opportunity for them, themselves, and for their children as well. But I think one of the things that is critically important is to help them understand the value of this. Well, when there are jobs, for example, in warehouses, very much a big part of my district as well, where you can earn $20 an hour. It's very hard to say to someone, why don't you take on this debt? Take on this burden of funding and education in the hopes that you will earn more later on in your career when you could earn this $20 an hour now, and helping them to understand that, for example, as automation comes to those warehouses, those jobs may not be there. And not only that, it's helping them to understand, although I've focused on it, because this is right now what I think people are thinking, that there's more to an education. There's more to higher attending a college or university, whether it's virtually or in person or a hybrid model, that will help to build your skills as an individual to help you realize the aspirations that you have. So we have to balance those things in helping people to understand how important higher education could be to their future and their community as a whole.
Excellent point. Thank you. I guess I'll go back now and ask you a question for the whole group, since I'm sort of bouncing all over the place. But when we talk about a clog in the pipeline of eligible workers coming out of college at any age, what are areas of the economy getting hit the hardest? And what could this mean for the Commonwealth as a whole?
I'll jump in and say that in terms of health professions and specifically nursing, we're in a crisis. And it is the case that we are seeing our rural health systems and even some of our urban health systems have to pay travel nurses an exorbitant salary to get the bedside care that we need. So it's a crisis. And I think it's a little early for the research to tell us the root cause of that. But I will speculate that the pandemic was part of it. At the beginning of the pandemic at Western Governors University, we saw applications to our College of Health Professions spike. And it's akin to running into an emergency. People wanted to step up and be the hero, be the shero, and take care of folks that needed care. As the pandemic has waged on, year after year after year, we are seeing a decline in the interest in the nursing profession. We are also seeing mass retirements of people leaving the profession, and it is leaving health systems of all kinds in a real bad situation for bedside nursing care. And the reason I call out rural hospitals is it becomes more difficult just because of the size of the population to attract people to move there for the long term. Hence, the solution right now is not sustainable. It is the high cost of bringing expert travel nurses to care for the people in the community.
Well, I have a question here from the chat from one of our attendees here for the entire panel. The question is, can I ask what are the steps actually being taken to bring more educators and administrators of color into our schools where over 99% of our students are Black, brown, and low income?
I'll start by talking about the educator pipeline as opposed to talking about the individual school. So there are many efforts that are underway, but I'm going to call out three. The Center for Black Educator Development is a national organization, but it's based in Philadelphia. And they are developing a pipeline of educators of color to serve in diverse classrooms. They're running Freedom Schools in the summer, their own model of the Marian Wright Edelman Freedom School. They also have their own model of, we'll call it Future Teachers of America. There is a larger, and this is the second call out I'll do, a larger model that's in place is called Educators Rising. And it's done on a national scale, but local school districts have to adopt chapters. And when they have a higher ed partner, it becomes even more beneficial, so that they are doing that very thing that we heard about in the last panel. And that's inspiring great, talented high school students to consider the education profession. And then I'll call out one additional partnership that WGU has, and we are a partner with an organization called Operation Socrates. And Operation Socrates brings former military to the classroom. Sometimes we've heard that there's a different program, Troops to Teachers, but it's that essential pathway out of military expertise into the classroom. And we know that our military members represent a very diverse population. So those are three things that I will call out, of which I'm aware and we're partnering with.
I'd say too, at the institutional level, we're all paying a lot of attention to the pool of applicants that we have and making sure that we generate interest among a more diverse pool. At institutions whose enrollment has declined, though, because enrollment declines typically happen in a year, but right sizing of an institution and the labor force to react to that enrollment decline usually takes a couple of years. So many of our institutions within Pennsylvania who've experienced enrollment declines aren't in a position right now where they're hiring new faculty, where they're hiring new staff in some cases, except to replace positions that open through attrition, perhaps, and they're in their critical positions. But where that does happen, we're taking a very intentional look at how we recruit and retain employees of color.
I'll add to that, and Dr. Patterson is very well aware, as part of system redesign, one of the things that we're looking at in the PASHE system is diversity and equity and inclusion. And so not just focusing on one particular career path, but in every corner of our institutions, we have to focus on these. This has to be something from the ground up, maybe below ground in our roots, that we actually, really incorporate this into our philosophy of how we operate our institutions, how we hire people to staff our institutions, from faculty and administrators, to the folks that are, working in our facilities per se, to make sure that we are reflecting better the student body that we're hoping will come to our institutions, but they'll feel more comfortable. That our communities, sort of the town gown relationship. I had a student once say to me, I've repeated this a lot of times, but he said, I can't get a haircut in this town because there weren't barbers that would necessarily be able to respond to the needs of, a student of color. So those are certainly things that we have to focus on. And I'll add one more thing that's a particular interest of mine, and legislation that I've sponsored. Our DACA students, our dreamers. We have had, I know of at least 3 students who went through our system, went to not only PASHE schools, but other institutions, got teaching degrees, and could not get teacher certification in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This is something that we would have to change by law in terms of the teacher certification process. I've introduced legislation to do that and have not made much progress yet. But when I, knew some of these students and where they came from, some of the low income neighborhoods in our community, and they wanted to return to those particular schools so they could, model the kind of individual that students could look up to. What a shame. It is shameful that we cannot respond to that by encouraging more people of, diverse backgrounds with not necessarily just exactly the right credentials, perhaps, but these students had college degrees. But there are others out there too that could help to respond to meeting that need.
Senator, I will just reinforce and applaud that work, because one of the highest need areas that we have for educators, we know that it's special education, we know that it's secondary STEM, but we also know teachers that can teach English language learners. So think of a dreamer becoming an educator and can help fill that very, very high need area. So congratulations on that effort.
We don't have to look out of state. We'll need to, but we have those resources here. We have to be more flexible about it.
And I think Shippensburg University has also been very successful in this area in the past. I think Dr. Patterson, didn't Shippensburg partner recently with L&I and Pesci Foundation to upskill workers at a giant grocery store? You guys have several examples of training programs that address the needs of, I know we were talking just a minute ago about minority and rural communities, right? Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Dr. Patterson. Sorry.
No, thank you for that. We do actually have a collaboration with the giant company on workforce development. It actually involves 3 higher education institutions, but is supported by the state system and the Pesci Foundation, and a recent $250,000 grant through L&I, or Labor and Industry. And it builds upon Governor Wolf's PA SMART initiative, which the administration has distributed about $60 million statewide since 2018 to expand job training. And what this does is it builds upon an existing leadership program created by giant company and its employees, and expands into additional occupations to serve dislocated workers, particularly with underserved populations in South Central PA. It also involves Harrisburg Area Community College and the Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, as we are developing curriculum and accredited education to put workers on a successful career pathway within agribusiness, but also a burgeoning workforce in transportation, warehousing, and manufacturing.
Awesome. I'm sorry, I didn't know if you wanted to say something, Senator Schwenk.
I do, of course. It's good to talk about these excellent examples, and there are many of them throughout the Commonwealth. One that I feel that we missed, and I think the responsibility is on the legislature for not making it happen. The Governor Wolf had proposed the Nellie Bly Scholarship Program, which could have helped 44,000 low-income students to attend college at no tuition costs for most of them, for the most part. It could have been a game changer. Unfortunately, it did not get funded, and we had the wherewithal to be able to do that this year. But even though Governor Wolf will not be here, I'm hopeful that that's a program legislation that we can continue to look to the legislature to support. It would be an instant boost to so many students, help us with enrollment most certainly, and help us to fund and to support some of these critical issues like teacher shortages and other workforce shortages that we absolutely need to. And this would have been, by the way, for not only, four-year institutions, but our community colleges as well, which we should talk about too, for sure.
Yeah, and that is, and to build upon that, Senator Schwank, that's very important funding because that funding goes directly to students.
Right.
Not to the institutions directly, but directly to students for them to be able to afford higher education and community college. And so we look forward to continue to advocate for that in the future.
All right. Well, if there's not much more, if there's more you want to talk about community college, I'm open to hearing that. I'm alumni of community college myself, so I'm a big fan.
As am I. And so
great.
as a community college alum, yeah, I am a huge fan. And I do think when we talked about some of those barriers of access and cost, our community colleges are key for so many people to be able to get that post-secondary education that is aligned to a career, that is rich in the skills that they need to be able to get into the workforce. Community colleges are going to be the solution to the nursing crisis because you can get an associate degree in nursing and become a registered nurse and then continue your education beyond that. So, so many of the critical talent needs that we have across the Commonwealth, community colleges are really the answer to that. And like Shippensburg and like all universities that serve folks in the Commonwealth, we have at WGU, we have articulation agreements with community colleges so that we are honoring the learning that they have completed at a community college, articulating those credits. And to that point, it's a way for folks to build on the foundation that they've started, get into the workforce. Let's talk IT. If you go to a community college and you get IT learning, in fact, you get some of those certificates that President Patterson was talking about, you can get wooed away by an employer with a very, very, very good salary, and then you stop out before you finish your education. The challenge of that is it's so tempting for folks in that industry to do that, but then what they find is they're unable to advance in their career. So they want to keep that wage coming in, they want to keep that work going, and they want to continue their learning. So I know I'm a broken record, but I'm coming back to this needs for the adult learner to continue to build on their previous success, to build on the learning that they've had, and community colleges are essential on those pathways.
Yeah, it's the laddering effect that we had talked about that balances career and education. For example, getting your nursing associates, and then moving that into a RN to BSN degree at a 4-year institution allows you to move up in the career field, and you'll see these connections between community colleges and 4-year institutions, so that laddering and credentialing can continue throughout the career pathway. And that's an important collaboration between those institutions. Something that we're exploring across PASHE with all of our institutions and community colleges within Pennsylvania.
I'll only add that community colleges are really unsung heroes in terms of, as Dr. Patterson said, being one of those rungs on the ladder I'd say not just to career path, but to success in life. It's a less intimidating for many of our students, option to become, sort of engaged in higher education. So that students that are transferring from high school who may not have had such, not necessarily a good experience, but not have had sort of the background to recognize how critical higher education could be to their future. It's a very, very affordable way to get started on that. They work very quickly. Our particular Reading area community college that serves my district has come forward with a capital assistance request to begin enhancing a total school of health sciences. They already are offering some of those opportunities, but the need is so great among employers and the desire by students. Students know too. where the good career opportunities are. So they're seeking that out as well. And I certainly want to, hope that we can encourage that kind of development. And I'll note just one more thing is that the community colleges also, have a direct connection to high schools as well. Students can be attending community college and earning credits while they're still in high school. They can do that at other institutions. But again, this may be a less intimidating way to get started. And that's what we've got to do, get people started.
Right. We have another question from an attendee that came to me through the Q&A. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to put it to you three. You're the experts. Sticking with the topic of community colleges here. The question is, can you address transferring community college credits to institutions of higher education? I experienced difficulty when I was in college, but was eventually able to graduate a semester early and enter the workforce.
I'll start by, I'm sorry, Dr. Patterson. I'll just start by saying it's really important to have those connections between the community college and the university. So we create what are essentially called articulation agreements, where our registrar looks at the registrar's information from the community college, and that pathway is mapped. And when those relationships between a community college and a university are in place, no one should experience what the asker of the question just brought up, that it should be smooth, it should move right through. It is sometimes the case where a particular course at a community college does not align directly with the required course in the baccalaureate degree. So it is sometimes that there is a little bit of work back and forth, sometimes to just say, well, this credit won't articulate. But sometimes when two institutions are working together and they recognize we just need this additional skill covered in this associate degree course, then it can get resolved. And it's just like we've been talking about, it's listening and responding and working to remove barriers for students.
Exactly. And I think you could throw into that too, especially for adult learners, those that have been in the career field, competency-based experiences to be able to augment credits that the student may not need to take because of their prior experience, and thus reducing the time to degree so they can get their credentials faster.
I think Dr. Watts and Dr. Patterson said it so well. And the key word that I'd like to focus on are barriers, that we just sometimes are so ingrained in the way that we do things. We heard this in the last panel too, did we not? That we're not necessarily looking at how we could make this easier to treat students and, their support group, whatever that may be, their family or friends, whatever, with dignity, as consumers, and to give them the options that they need to succeed, no matter if they're 18 or they're 43, that they have, that we're trying to accommodate them. I had a, experience working at an institution of higher education where a student, because of illness, missed a 400 level course. So she had to come back an extra year and pay that extra tuition to pick up that course because it was only offered once. That lesson stuck with me, that, she was desperate. It was, we were able to work it out to some degree in terms of helping her to finance that, to pay for that extra, those extra credits, but it shouldn't have happened. With the technology that's available, and the opportunity to just our mandate to help students succeed, we should be doing better.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking at the clock here, and it seems that we have about 7 minutes left, maybe less, of this panel. Boy, time flies when you're having fun, right? But or when you're having edifying conversation. But I wanted to get to one last question, which is for all three of you anyway. And it really is around the crux of the question, like, what are the best ways that Pennsylvania schools can stay competitive? You know, they're struggling with enrollment. This is both public and private. And recruit and enrollment and boost it. So I'll let you know.
Yeah, let me speak on behalf of the state system, and certainly Senator, please jump in too. There's been a lot of work done in the last 4 years to bring efficiencies into the system through system redesign that allows us to keep costs as low as we possibly can for students. In fact, we've frozen tuition now for 4 consecutive years, and we've have a commitment of keeping education affordable. We've received historic increases in funding from the General Assembly, I would argue, in response to our efforts to keep costs down in order to pass on those savings to students in the form of tuition freezes and a commitment to system redesign. Again, that results in those greater efficiencies. But if we're going to look at how we stay competitive, we need to continue to invest in developing the workforce ecosystem and bringing employers to the table by spending time listening, not dictating, if you will, and presenting less helpful information. We need those collaborations with educational institutions to ensure that we're meeting the region's labor force needs. So that's one of the reasons that we're so focused on system redesign and passing those savings on to students.
I will totally agree with Dr. Patterson. Well said. I have been a part of the system since system redesign started. I don't think that process will ever end. Sorry to say, Dr. Patterson, that this is the way that we stay competitive, is to be constantly looking at the horizon and beyond, to continuing those conversations with certainly our students and employers, and not to forget, as we mentioned in the last panel too, the contributions of our faculty and staff and how we help them to continue to want to stay in the system, to be energized, to do the job. A lot of partnerships required to make this system work as well as it possibly can. We've kind of fallen into a pattern, and we've got to re-examine everything that we do, all of us, along the way. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited about the changes that can happen. And I'll add, the only other thing that I'll add to this is that in terms of funding, Governor Wolf made just a significant contribution to education funding across the board, from pre-K, we didn't even talk about that, all the way up to higher education. We will have to continue that. This can't be just a 4-year or 8-year commitment. This is something that we and future governors will have to continue to focus on, because we know that Pennsylvania was very, very far behind in terms of our ranking in funding. Funding isn't the end all and be all, but we can't do much unless we really are, we have the resources to be able to make those changes. We have to continue that commitment. And I hope our business community and the entire our community as a whole understands the value of that and will support us in that.
Yeah, and each institution that is receiving additional funds, whether it's an addition to the base allocation or it's one-time funds that the Commonwealth and our elected officials have been gracious to support us in, we're investing those funds in expanding student opportunities to improve student outcomes, increasing retention, graduation rates, looking at attracting non-traditional students, as we've talked about, creating affordable pathways for students to earn credentials. Each institution is really focused on sustainably operating their university's programs in a financially viable way and enhancing partnerships with the state and investing in people and infrastructure to meet the evolving needs of our students and enhancing our information systems so that we can collaborate across institutions more holistically.
As a non-public institution that does not receive funding from the Commonwealth, I'm going to agree with pretty much everything that my colleague said. We can't stop innovating. What is needed in 2022 is different than what will be needed in 2024. So I think, Senator, you described it as the system redesign. It will never be finished. None of us will ever be finished, because if, in fact, higher education is to fulfill its role in society, it is to help society move forward and create healthy, thriving communities. And everything else is changing around us, business and industry. We heard it in the last panel. The insurance company of 2022 looks nothing like the insurance company of 1952. No, it doesn't. And it's going to look different. We've already seen the move to remote work. What are we doing to prepare our students for remote work when they graduate? We'll constantly be innovating. So I guess for any of us to stay competitive, it's listen with the intent to change and act, and it is to never rest on your laurels, constantly innovate.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you so much for these extraordinarily valuable insights from our panel this afternoon. Once again, I know that this was a big chunk out of your day, and you have very busy schedules. So a big, big thank you to Dr. Charles Patterson from Shippensburg University, State Senator Judy Schwenk, and Dr. Rebecca Watts from Western Governors University. So thank you again for joining us, and I will now toss it back to our distinguished MC, Greg Salisbury.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you, panelists, for another educational panel. Our last panel of the day will be on addressing Pennsylvania's education funding shortfall. This panel will be moderated by Francine Schertzer, the Senior Vice President and Chief Content Officer of PCN. Please welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. And thank you to City and State for including PCN in today's summit. I'd like to introduce our panelists who are gracious enough to join us today. First of all, joining us is State Representative Carrie Lewis Del Rosso. She represents the 33rd Legislative District, including Allegheny and Westmoreland County. Dr. Eric Becote, Superintendent of the William Penn School District, and Sharon Ward, Senior Policy Advisor for the Education Law Center. Sharon, if we could start with you, maybe just as a very basic place to start the discussion, can you explain, for those that may not be familiar, the breakdown of education funding, how it's broken down between state, federal, and local?
Yes, sure, Francine. Thanks. And thanks very much for having me here today. So I think there are two important things to understand about education financing. The first is that funding education is primarily a responsibility of the state. So the state is responsible for education funding. And in Pennsylvania, about 38.5% of all education funds come from state dollars and 47% from local dollars. The second important thing to know is that how those funds are raised really makes a big difference in terms of what school districts have available. And we'll talk a lot about the disparities within school districts, but in a state that relies so heavily on local property taxes as we do, and we are not the norm, we are in fact at the bottom of state funding nationally, but our over-reliance on local property taxes means that we have wide disparities that frankly will make it difficult to achieve the kinds of really interesting ideas and innovations that we've talked about today, because many of our school districts really aren't able to provide the basics. And that's the challenge that we have.
How does the contribution of Pennsylvania to education compare to how other states contribute to their school funding?
So again, we're low. We are 38%. The national average is 45%. It's a little bit higher than that, 47%. 55% of our funding comes from local governments. So we are very reliant on local property taxpayers. And That's a challenge for them, and also a challenge, particularly in the low wealth districts that aren't able to raise dollars that they need locally.
Dr. B. Coates, if I could bring you into this discussion from the perspective of a superintendent, how would you characterize how the William Penn School District has been impacted by the level of school funding that it receives?
The lack of school funding for the school district here, I think, is a monumental challenge. It has definitely challenged us. When I started in the district in May of 2020, we were in a position where we were wondering how we were going to support students in a virtual environment. So something as simple as providing Chromebooks to students or some type of technological device was a great challenge for us at that particular time. So that's just one example. The other thing that I would bring to your attention is our facilities are basically deplorable. And there are environments in which we definitely need to improve and enhance to ensure that our students are educated in a safe environment. So those are just two examples that I would bring to your attention.
Representative Del Rosso, if we can bring you into this discussion as well. You represent a district in southwestern Pennsylvania. What do you hear from your constituents specifically regarding school funding levels?
Well, I'm sorry I missed the first part of the initial. So Carrie Lewis Del Rosso here. I represent the Allegheny Valley, the 33rd district, which is Allegheny East and Westmoreland County. Right now, I think what I'm hearing from my public schools is that, you know, they're having trouble. They're setting up a deficit walking in. But I think it's more important to understand what actually we're spending our money on. And I think that, you know, every child, deserves an exceptional education. So one of the things, you know, when I got elected, I went to my school district superintendents, and I've had a very open relationship and open discussion with them on this. And it's been wonderful, as you all know, that I'm no longer going to be representing the 33rd to have those relationships with them.
One of the largest portions of school funding comes from local property taxes. Maybe at this point we have a good discussion on what are the benefits or the drawbacks of having that local control. Dr. B. Coates, would you start us out?
Sure. I think having local control is great. However, I also think that there are some challenges when you look at the property values of the homes that are within your actual boroughs. So within William Penn, we support 6 boroughs: Alden, Cowden, Darby, East Lansdowne, and Yeadon. And we are, if I'm not mistaken, we have the highest tax burden, or we put the highest tax burden on our residents. I believe we have the highest in Delaware County, and I believe we're the second highest in the state. And so I believe our taxpayers are footing the bill and are putting forward as much as they can. And so we're really at a place where the level of local control is now limited, because, you know, at some point you have to say, how much more are we going to put on the taxpayer?
And I think that, that's an important point. And I think we have to separate out local control and local funding. We are a local control state. There was a time when Pennsylvania state funds paid for more than 50% of the cost of education. That number, again, is down to just a little bit over 38%. Having property taxes is beneficial in the sense that they're stable. So I don't think we want to eliminate property tax funding for schools. There's a role for a local contribution. But what happens, and I think is, Dr. B. Coates has indicated, is if you don't have a lot of local wealth, you could raise your taxes very high and not generate a lot of money. So I'm going to give you an example. 2 school districts, the Reading School District, we heard Senator Schwenk talk a little bit about Reading. Their local wealth is about $74,000 per student. They're the lowest in the state. The New Hope Soulbury School District has about $1.6 million in local wealth for each student. So when you raise taxes, you can raise them very high in Reading and not generate much local dollars, and not raise them very high at all in New Hope and generate enough money to pay for everything that you need. So that is the challenge. There's a role for local contributions, but the state has got to fill in that gap, and it's not doing so effectively today.
Representative, your thoughts on the benefits or drawbacks of local control?
So, we just approved an additional $800 million for education. Our local taxes are continuing to go up, and only a third of that money is actually making it to the actual classroom. People are angry. The return on investment, unfortunately, it is not there. We have 500 school districts in our state. I'm not about, taking away completely property taxes, but what are we doing? I think we need major reform. I think we have senior citizens that are being taxed out of their house, and unfortunately, I have 3 districts in my district actually that are almost out close to $30,000 an average cost per pupil, and that just goes to show you that even though we're putting up all this money in the state funding, and the taxes are going up, that where are we going with this? There's a significant need for change here, and I hear it all the time. I heard it when I was at the doors. People are getting taxed out of their houses. It's not good. So with that being said, I think that we have something to look at, and it's an ongoing issue.
Representative, there have been a number of attempts to eliminate the property tax or alter it over the years. Why is this such a difficult initiative to pass through the legislature?
I think it's because people are afraid that the funding source is going to, drop, and people are also they're worried that public schools will suffer from this. And quite honestly, I don't think that's the case at all. I think public schools will become more competitive. I think that my 3 children go to public schools, and I have a story of my own. I got a tax assessment bill in the mail, and my school taxes went up incrementally. And I have 3 kids that during the pandemic were out of school. And I was at home with them. So if we're going to be funding the brick and mortar schools, and we're going to be funding, public education, we just have to make sure that we're actually funding the source. And unfortunately, like I said, I'm a hands-on mother, not only a mom, but a representative. And I'm seeing that, our kids are suffering from this. So, with that being said, you've got someone who's in the thick of it. And also, I graduated from the Scranton School District, which is, they've been upside down and in debt for more than 40 years. So again, we've really got to concentrate on what we're doing here, education and educating our future, all of our kids. So I'm very happy to be on this call today, but we really need a solution.
Yeah, and I want to also agree with Sharon, who stated that I do believe that there is a role for local control and, the local elected officials implementing a tax structure. But I think the thing that's key that Sharon alluded to was that, there is a gap, right? And that the state was at one level and now they're not. And so for us, it's the dollars that we have, how are they consistently coming in? We can't be on again, off again with the resources. So our special education population in our district is 20% of our population of students. Those students have needs, or students with disabilities, those students have needs. We also are serving students who come to us, and we have to accept those students as they are. And I'm not making an excuse, but there are needs that our students have that we're not able to meet. So when you don't have a steady stream of income, then you have to begin to pick and choose where you spend your dollars. And then we're also, tasked with supporting our teachers. And I want to make sure that we're able to attract and maintain the teachers that we have. And so we have to also look at the salary that we're paying our teachers. So it's a multifaceted approach, but I do believe that it has to be something that is consistent. We need a consistent stream of funding because the students aren't going away. And so we have to be able to support them.
I think it's, if I can just jump in, I think we have to look at both the expense side and also the income side. And I think Dr. Becoats is right. And as Secretary Haggerty mentioned today, we had a school funding system that basically went up 2% a year for 20 years. And so it really delinked the costs of educating students and the needs from our funding system. So that started us in a deficit. And it's only been really since 2015 that we've had a funding formula, that the bipartisan funding formula, that is beginning to look at directing funds to school districts based on the students' needs and the school district characteristics. And still only 20%, less than 20% of our funds are going through that. So we have to start there. The other thing is that, when Dr. Becoats and I were in school, the demands were a little bit lower. I mean, the demands on kids right now are much greater. We have standards in place that weren't in place before. We've got graduation requirements. We have set a goal for our students, and it's much higher than it has been in previous generations. They have technology that they need to use, and that's more expensive. And costs for things like special education have gone up. We don't talk a lot about that, but special education is over $5 billion, or about $5 billion in the Commonwealth, which is a large expense, and the state share of that is very low. The state share is only 21% of those funds. So that provides a valuable type of education for students with disabilities, and ensures that they have a free and appropriate education. It's required under law, and it has opened doors for, hundreds of thousands of students with disabilities, but we are paying more money for that. And funding for that type of education has not kept pace at all.
Right.
And so can I also add something as well? Special education is not just for kids with disabilities; it's for the high functioning kids as well, gifted children as well. And sometimes I don't think we focus on that too, because these kids who are accelerated learners, especially in public education, are not funded as much as the kids who need to be brought up. I think that there's a significant need for both. And I think that this is where truly our children and our population in Pennsylvania, and this is why the education funding needs to follow the student, because sometimes adequate education is not being offered, in especially some of the smaller schools. Again, we have 500 districts, and as the population decline, especially I know out in Western Pennsylvania, and the graduation rates are a lot less, is that our kids are not getting the adequate education they can, even at the higher end and at the lower end. So this is where I think we have to take a look at, where, certain education needs to be, combined together. And that way then that we can pay the teachers fairly. Our teachers are soldiers on the ground. They are a group of people that are getting hammered with mandates right now. And I think that that's where, I think it's important that we're looking at every child's need, not just, administration and funding the apparatus versus the actual students.
Are there what would result if a larger portion of our school funding was shifted to the state as opposed to local? What would happen there?
What you'd have is students not learning in hallways and basements. You would have schools where they have more than one counselor for 800 students. During that, and we haven't talked about the school funding trial, but we got a real peek at what's happening in a lot of rural and urban schools. We have schools where they have one bathroom for 150 elementary school students. I mean, we're failing to meet kids' basic needs. And if we had more state funding, we'd be able to do that. The other thing is that, and I think this was clear in the first panel, our educators really do know what it takes to teach children and help them to succeed. And in places where they have the resources, they're able to do that. I remember having a conversation with a school superintendent who was on a board of a group that I was with. And he said, we have 40 kids in our school district. We have 3 programs for each one of those kids. That's simply not the case in most school districts. So we'd have more programs to do exactly what Representative Luis Del Grosso has said. We need to meet all children's needs. So we'd be able to do that. We'd be able to address the specific needs of students of color, learning needs of students who are English learners. About 16% of kids in our public schools are Latinx students. So many of them are multi-language learners. They do speak a language, and we need to help them with English. So I think we would spend a lot of time helping to prepare those students. And what we'd see is they'd graduate, they'd go on to great careers and great colleges, and the state's economy would grow, because that's really the bottom line about why we invest in education to begin with.
And I would be, remiss if I did not say that, we were pleased with the increase in Level Up funding and the increase in BEF funding that we did receive. So I don't want to negate that fact, but I also want to state that it happened for the 22-23 fiscal year. We don't know what's going to happen for 23-24. So those dollars were able to help our district. But again, the question is, will it be consistent and will it continue? And we just can't have the on again, off again. And so, for example, we don't have enough social workers. We still don't have enough of them. And so a lot of our students are coming to schools with those challenges. One of the things I would also say, though, is it does matter how you utilize your funds. And so what we've tried to do in our district is develop a strategic plan that would get us through at least 2025. And so we're trying to be very strategic in our approach of allocating our resources, because I know that some people will say, well, how much is enough? How much are you going to continue to ask for? So I think, in this district, we do have a way in which we want to approach our growth and moving our district forward. And that's just one example that I would state. But again, I do want to recognize that we did receive some additional funding, and it has helped. But again, I can't tell you today that that's enough. And I am uncertain as to what's going to happen in the 23-24 fiscal year.
Representative Luis Del Grosso, there are many ways to view the disparities in public education: economic, racial, geographic. What's government's role in addressing these disparities?
Well, I think this is where we work hand in hand with our superintendents and asking them. But again, education is for everybody. We try to look at how many of these kids are actually, staying and living and working in Pennsylvania. Our goal, I think, especially in our 9 through 12 programs, are to make sure that we are actually
Unfortunately, I think we have a technical problem, so we're going to move along, and hopefully Representative Luis Del Grosso will be able to rejoin us in just a moment. Sharon, a moment ago, you had referenced the ongoing lawsuit that the Education Law Center is among several of the groups filing. Can you talk a little bit about this lawsuit that's challenging the state's school funding system, and just a brief summary about this trial that just wrapped up recently?
Sure. Happy to do so, and happy to have Dr. Becoats, who's one of our plaintiff school districts here and has been on the front line of all of this. So in 2014, a group of school districts and parents and students filed a lawsuit alleging that the state's school funding system was unconstitutional. It did not meet the requirements of the Thorough and Efficient Clause, and also violated the equal protection provisions of the state constitution. There is in Pennsylvania, as in most states, there is actually a constitutional requirement that the General Assembly provide for education for students. So that case started in 2014. It took a while to wend its way through the courts, and in November of last year, we started a trial before the Commonwealth Court. That trial has concluded. The last arguments were in July, and now we'll await a decision from Commonwealth Court Judge Renee Cohen-Jubileer, who heard the case. We should get a decision probably by the end of the year. And school funding lawsuits have been brought in other states that have these similar constitutional provisions, and believe that this is that we made a great case that our state is failing to meet its constitutional obligation, and we're looking forward to the decision.
Dr. B. Coates, the Lee Penn School District is a party to this lawsuit. Why did your school district become involved?
Well, what I can say is that I was not here when the suit was filed. I joined the district in 2020. However, when I came to the district, there were some things that I noticed in terms of our inability to provide some adequate resources for our students. I previously was in the school district of Philadelphia as an assistant superintendent. And one of the things that my network did under the leadership of Dr. Haidt, who was the then superintendent, we did make additional investments in the schools that I oversaw. And as a part of that process, we did see improvements. And so we were talking about things like social workers, counselors, computers, making sure that the buildings were up to a certain standard. So what I can say is that providing those additional resources for the 4.5 years in which I was in the school district of Philadelphia did prove to be beneficial for the schools that I supported. The goal was to make sure that those schools exited, if you will, the lower performance tier that we had established within the district, and several of those schools were able to do that. So what I would say to you is that I do believe that resources matter. And I think that they matter most when they are aligned to goals and strategies that you're trying to implement within a school system.
Sharon, you mentioned that similar lawsuits have taken place in other states. What kind of results have come out of those lawsuits?
So I think there's probably been about 30 years in which state constitutional lawsuits have been brought. They have been largely successful. They have largely resulted in additional dollars going to school districts, including those that are the least funded. And one of the witnesses at our trial, Dr. Rucker Johnson from Stanford, I believe, has been doing a lot of work studying the results of these lawsuits. And what he has found is that in states where they've put money in the most underfunded districts over time consistently, as Dr. B. Coates had suggested, we've seen real changes in student performance from the very kids who started at the beginning. The money went in, they graduated. You could really demonstrate improvements in their achievement. And that's precisely why we're doing this, because we do believe that it will mean that kids who right now are struggling and left behind will simply be on the same playing field as other kids and be able to survive, thrive, and have productive careers and lives.
Representative
I'm sorry the call dropped. I'm back. My apologies.
Representative, as we're talking about this school funding lawsuit that's the trial's just wrapped up, defendants in the case argue that Pennsylvania spends more per capita on education than other states. Overall, does more school funding result in better performance?
So yeah, the state ranks about 44th, I think, in spending. And that refers to the percentage of like total spending that comes from the state government versus other sources in local government, Pennsylvania. I'm like I said, I'm a mother of 3. I think the best indicator of school performance is enrichment at home. And unfortunately, some of that just doesn't happen, right? Like we have no control over that. As a person who was in public relations and worked for the Penn Hill School District and Riverview School District, the different demographics, are indicators to school performance. Your SPP scores are based on some of this, and I think it's a clear indicator, and those are things that we can't control. What we do, I think, is I'm big in this is also just making sure transparency is kept too. Many school districts right now, and their capital reserves are holding a lot of money. So what are we doing with them? And we need to make sure that we're, placing that in the right way. And look, everyone's learning needs are different. I was hearing you talk about, strategic plans. I helped write a strategic plan for the Riverview School District and teaching, individualized learning plans for each kid, whether you had an actual IEP versus not having an IEP. I think that all of our kids learn differently, and it's important that we fund people, but at the same time, again, funding the student is more important than funding that apparatus that we just have no control over. And it's more of transparency than anything that we need to see right now.
Yeah, I just want to address that. I mean, about 90% of kids in Pennsylvania are in public schools, and that's school district schools or charter schools. So I think if we're really going to focus on education, we need to focus on the kids who are in those schools. I worked in early childhood for years. Early childhood is essentially a voucher-funded program. It's a program where people pay, either the state provides some support for low-income families or parents pay themselves. It's almost impossible to get a quality education at a childcare program because there's not enough money or consistency to be able to support over the course of time those programs with voucher-based programs. So, that may work in some places, but I think in that system, it's required massive investments of additional state dollars to ensure to even get those childcare programs up to a basic level of quality. We have a great public school system. I don't think we want to dismantle it. If we do that, we end up with chaos. I think we will end up losing businesses who really rely on a workforce. So there are ways that we could improve our public schools. I was really, again, struck in the prior panel about how committed to accountability and innovation and improvement our, school district leadership is and will be, and they need to be held accountable. We have a system that provides a lot of students with a great quality education and could provide all students with a great quality education if we fund it adequately.
What criteria will be used to measure whether or not the state has met its constitutional obligation to fund public education?
Well, that's a conversation for the lawyers. There's a lot of conversation going on right now as to what an appropriate legal standard is for that. And we have an argument. I think that the respondents in the case have their own argument. If I can summarize it, I think the respondents' argument has been, we just have to provide a basic education. We just need to have the light bulbs on and the pipes working, although we have learned that the pipes don't always work. But the level is we just need to provide something basic. What our attorneys have argued is that a thorough and efficient education means that all kids need to be able to meet the standards that we have set for them. So it's a higher bar. And we will know what the judge decides.
Even if the courts rule in favor of the petitioners, Representative, I'd like to direct this at you. Wouldn't the legislature still retain the obligation of actually crafting that state budget and determining funding levels?
Yes, and actually, I still think about, we're underfunded. We're $4,000, higher than the national average at this point. And I don't think that, again, parents of children, I think offering them that choice is very important without dismantling the system. And again, as a public school mother, I think I have every right, to say that, every child is different. And I think, the legislative body will take a look at that. And we need to be able to agree on these kinds of things. And I think it's okay to get people at the table to discuss these kinds of issues as well.
Dr. B. Coates, if the court rules in your favor, what would you like to see a funding redesign look like?
Well, I think that's a discussion that we'll have, at that particular time. Obviously, one of the things I definitely want to do is make sure that we're able to support students based upon the needs that they have. So, for example, things such as social and emotional learning. I think as someone said earlier on one of the panels, having someone in a school building that's able to address some of those issues, or mental health issues, having a person in every building. Also being able to have an assistant principal in buildings as well. I'm a firm believer, in all of my prior experiences definitely lead me to believe and know that you have to have someone who's solely focused on the instructional program, but then you also have to deal with the climate and the culture. And so how do you go about doing that within a school building? I also think that we have to look at the number of students that are in the classroom. When you're talking about 40 students or 35 students in a classroom, is that really conducive to students' learning abilities? So we have to look at the spaces in which we're educating them as well. So I would like to see some changes in those arenas. I did talk about social workers. I talked about counselors. There's no way that one counselor can effectively serve 300 and some students at one point in time within a school year. So things of that nature, I would want us to hopefully be able to address. As well as providing more supports for our teachers. I think that's critical as we look at the teacher shortage that we know is inevitable, unfortunately.
In light of
And
things
if I
like,
I can just add one more thing too, is that I hear what you're saying, and I know how crucial it is to have these resources in schools. But it's not the job of the education system to parent our children. That's the other thing too that I really want to make a solid case on, sir. And I understand, there are different demographics everywhere, but it is not the job of the public school system to parent our children. That's not the job. And I, as a mother, I'm saying that out loud. I've seen some of the things that are coming home with my kids, and it's tough on my soul. So I understand that where you're coming from, but we should be giving the parents the choice then to make these decisions if education is going to dictate what's going on in our homes.
And Representative Del Rosso, with all due respect, what I would say to you is that I am not advocating that educators parent children, but if you've ever been in a classroom and taught a class, you know that in order to teach a child, as an educator, the child has to be ready to learn. And sometimes children show up and they've been traumatized. They've had things that have gone on at home. And so they're sitting there in your room as a teacher. And at some point in time, we as the educators or in our buildings, we have to respond. And so we have an obligation to respond and to make sure that we work with that child where that child is in the building. So I don't believe that that's parenting. I believe that that's addressing the issue that's in front of you at that particular time. And so that's just like if I show up at a hospital and I'm bleeding, I need to address the person that's bleeding to make sure that they're able then to move on to the next piece. So that's what I'm advocating. We can't control what comes into our buildings. That's something that we can't control. But once they get into our building, it is our responsibility to make sure that that child is successful academically. And sometimes you have to touch and address other things before you can even get to the academics. That's the reality that we're dealing with.
And I think the other point is that public schools accept all students, they educate all students. At the Education Lawsuit Center, we constantly are getting calls from parents whose kids aren't accepted in private schools, whose kids are kicked out of private schools. During the trial, one of the witnesses was the head of a private school in York, and when asked about teaching kids that came, from economically disadvantaged families, he just said, we don't have the resources to teach those kids. Well, it's hard to justify public funding for schools that are not willing to educate all kids. And I think that's the challenge that we have. It's, Obviously, parents are the most important educators for kids. They're partners with schools, but some schools just go the old-fashioned route of just kicking the kid out, and we can't really accept that, and certainly not when public dollars are involved.
I have a question from one of our attendees. They write, what about parental support for children in foster care?
So for us, it does not really matter if you're in foster care or not. Our goal is to make sure that we support the child when they show up in our building, right? So if you have a foster parent, we're going to work with that parent just as if that was the child's natural parent. So for us, it's what are the needs of the child? We do have partnerships with other entities, and we try to make sure that we connect parents to those resources. We have a great community here. And so a lot of times there are people who will come in and volunteer and want to support students. And we definitely want to do that. So it's not always about the teacher that's doing the heavy lifting. Sometimes there are other people that we bring in or that we utilize to support those children. So for us, it doesn't matter if you're a foster child or you're not. The goal is to support the child so that they can succeed academically.
And there was some, in addition to the robust new funding that the General Assembly approved this year, which we're really grateful for. They also passed a bill that was sponsored by Senator Pat Brown and Senator Wayne Langerhoff. Senator Laughlin, that provides specific resources to help students who are in foster care or other out-of-home placements, who may move between school districts, and make sure that they don't get lost in the process. So that law went into effect this year, and we're just really pleased to see that happen, and that's going to really help a lot of kids who might move around from district to district and whose records may be lost, or who may take a course in one school district that's not counted in another school district. So really keep a focus on those kids. So it was another great thing that happened this year.
I'd like to talk briefly about the federal pandemic funds. What happens to schools when those funds expire, and how do you make decisions of how to spend that money that causes the least pain when that money does go away?
Right. So one of the things we tried to do was we tried to make sure that we could utilize as much of that money as possible on one-time expenses. We did not want to utilize that money to necessarily hire permanent staff, because we knew that when the money went away, we would potentially be faced with telling people you don't have a job, and that's not something we wanted to do. So we did purchase things like Chromebooks, a lot of technology. We were able to enhance, if you will, or update our curriculum. So typically you purchase something like curriculum every maybe 3 to 5 years or longer, but those are some of the items that we've used it for. We obviously use it for PPE equipment, personal protection equipment for the pandemic. So there were things of that nature that we really used the dollars for, which would have been one-time long-term expenses. We were able to also outfit some of the classrooms with technology so that teachers and students could communicate if they were not in the classroom. And so those are some things that we utilize those dollars for, but we are also realizing that, for example, we've utilized a lot of those dollars to provide some enrichment programs. So we've done that now for the last 2 summers. We're planning to do it for the next 2 summers with dollars that we've held so that we could pay for it, because you have to expend those dollars, I believe, for the most part by 2024. But after that, we don't have any money to continue our summer enrichment programming. So those are the types of things that will go away in the event that we do not find another funding stream or funding source for that particular initiative. But overall, the goal was not to do something that would cause harm later in terms of having to let individuals or employees go.
In light of things like the pandemic and school violence, there's been a growing need for school safety measures as well as mental health counseling in schools. Where does all of that fit in with the funding model?
So as it relates to ESSER funding, we were able to put into place some SEL curriculum. So now in our district, social emotional learning is something that is done across the district in grades K through 12 every day. That is the expectation, so that we're able to address that. So we have a curriculum or a support tool that can be used for that resource. Some other things that we've done, we've also looked at some SEL technology resources that are used as well. I am pleased to say that the state has provided is providing some additional dollars that we can use to look at security and safety measures. So, for example, we are looking at upgrading our servers that basically manage all of the technology behind our security systems. We're looking to make sure that we have the proper equipment in place and that it is operable. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do from a security and safety standpoint.
Dr. Bacotes, and this is Representative Del Rosso. I have a question for you, and you've been so great at explaining all this to me. And I think that the diversity in our state, people don't understand that every district is extremely different. What are your thoughts on? I feel like you guys have to set up your budget, in advance, and by the end of the year when you're starting in March to set up budgets for July. And you're waiting on us to approve those things, it's tough on you because you're trying to be as proactive as you can and not. Do you see that there would be a benefit to maybe kind of changing that in a way or updating us so things would be a little bit more proactive than reactive?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I thank you for asking that question. It is very important for us, ideally, to know what the state's plan is for a budget, because like you said, and this year it happened, we had to approve our budget before June 30th, and we did not know what the state budget was going to be. So we were really operating in the dark. So if there was a way or mechanism or something that was in place to ensure that districts knew what level of funding we would be receiving before we had to actually sign on the dotted line, for lack of better terms, if you would, I think that would be great. And so anything that you could do, or if that's something that could be looked into or discussed, etc., that would be great. And I think that would be very, very helpful. But we want to definitely be proactive versus reactive, because as you said, our fiscal year starts July 1, and we have to, by law, the board of directors have to have a budget in place before that date. Does that answer your question, Representative?
Yeah, and I think that it's an ever-changing environment that we have in education. The kids are changing, and you can't control what goes on in the house and things like that. And I hear you loud and clear. I have a very diverse district, and I think that that's one of the things that I bring to the legislature, and I hope I bring at the higher office level, that people understand that we need to change with the environment too. And I think that has a lot to do with education, period, across the board. I don't care if you're in a private, public, charter, whatever it is. I think that it's very, very important that we stress that for our kids, because like I said, every kid's needs are different. And if I could have my way, when the kid goes to kindergarten, they would have that file with them, and it would follow them through their whole entire life. That way, then if they are jumping around from school to school, and if there's a transient population, then the special ed stuff can kick in, and at least people know what the student is that they're looking at. Because I understand that, there are students that come into your school that, you don't have any control what's going on, and you want to educate them properly. And unfortunately, if you don't know the history, you got to start from scratch. And that's where we find our need is with our psychological, workforce too, is that we're having trouble finding good psychiatric help and counselors and social workers. So, thanks for doing what you do. I know that, we kind of all sit on different aisles of the fence, but I think it's important that we bring everything to the table and we get this fixed.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing that. And I agree with you. Thank you.
To what extent is early childhood education an indicator of success, and to what extent or should the state have the responsibility to provide that opportunity to its children?
I'll let you start and then I'll jump in.
One of the things that I firmly believe, I had the opportunity to work in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this was in the probably late 90s, early 2000s. And one of the things that all the research says, and it continues to say, is that when a child has a pre-kindergarten or early childhood experience, that child is more likely to be successful on their third grade reading assessment. So I would say to you and submit to you that it is critically important for us to have a pre-kindergarten or an early childhood program that is effective. I think one of the things that we could definitely do is make sure that our early childhood centers are talking to our K through 12 institutions so that we understand on the early childhood side what is needed when my child enters kindergarten, so that there could be a solid plan or a backwards mapping of this is what we need to do in the early childhood arena so that children are successful in kindergarten. And once we start or put in a plan like that, I think we can have and we will start seeing different results long term. And so for me, it's not about how much does it cost, because it's going to cost us more later if we don't address the issue early on. So that's what I would submit to you. And I believe the research still says that having that quality pre-kindergarten or early childhood program does benefit children on their third grade reading assessment. That's usually how it's measured.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I mean, that research for years has been early childhood investments, payback dividends, $20 for every dollar that's invested. It really helps kids and to meet that third grade reading benchmark, and that's really critical for their continued success in education. So Pennsylvania has pre-K counts. It's got Head Start and funds those programs. They don't reach all kids. I think maybe we're at 40% was the last number that I saw of eligible kids in high quality early childhood programs. So that's an area where it would be very beneficial to kids' school success.
Representative, I'd like to direct this at you, and I don't want to take us too far down a different road, but could you talk a little bit about the unfunded, the state pension liability and the impact that has on school funding levels regarding how much money makes it to the classroom versus toward paying pensions, and if that's still an issue that is before the legislature?
So I have to get off the call because I'm supposed to be on another one at 4:00. So my apologies, but I will say that I know at a local level, is that there is still a gap of unfunded money that goes to the pensions, and that is what holds back, to making sure that we are getting money to the classrooms. But again, I think that there's, as a long-term solution, I think we need to look at that, and we need to keep that on the table. I know that the PSERS board have been meeting. I don't have the court case in front of me, or I don't have the information in front of me that some of the stuff that they have been going over. But I think that, again, I feel, and I will always say this, is that our teachers are our soldiers on the ground. And I would not want to do anything to hurt that. But at the same time, if we're not investing properly, we need to take a look at that, because it is hurting the taxpayers, and it is a problem if we're not forecasting this correctly for the future, for our teachers and for our students.
Representative Carolus Del Rosa, thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate it. I thank you. I love the open discussion. I think, our kids and our future are the most important asset that we have in Pennsylvania. And I think that we need to continue to openly discuss it. So thank you so much for your time, and everyone that's on this call. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to just continue this discussion for a few more moments. Sharon, you talked a little bit more about looking at what some other states do. Is there another funding model that you see in other states that you'd like to see Pennsylvania emulate?
So, first of all, I'd love to see us get to the national average, at least, on state funding. Actually, really, where we probably might need to go beyond that. We have a funding gap, an adequacy gap of about $3.7 billion. And I think, Representative Luis Del Rosso asked a good question. How much is this going to cost? And I think we can answer that question. There is a methodology that is in our state law that helps us to assess what the cost is per student to educate all students to standard. And if we apply that, then we identify the funding gap as we have right now. And then, I would hope, and I think the expectation is that the General Assembly could look at that number, and then if we are successful in lawsuit, figure out a path to achieve that. It will include basic education, special education. It'll need to include facilities, probably also include early childhood. We do have some states that have universal pre-K. I think that would be a very good program that would help support our education, support all kids and really propel them towards where we need them to be. But I think, because each state system is different and each state's schools are different, we need to look here at home for our solution. And I think we have that within our own state law, our own methodology to figure out what Pennsylvania students need to meet Pennsylvania standards. And if we are successful in identifying and implementing that, I think we will really pay dividends. We had a conversation earlier. The earlier panel was about higher education. And the thing that struck me that I hope we remember is that state policy does make a huge difference. We look at North Carolina and Georgia. North Carolina was a state that did not have a lot of people with bachelor's degrees. And they created state policies to vastly expand their community colleges, make them free, and work with employers to educate kids. Georgia has had free in-state tuition for 30 years. That does a lot to keep kids in schools. New York just went to free tuition for in-state students for their system. So if you have the will and have the foresight to make this investment, it really does pay off where we want it to be, which is in jobs and economic growth and quality of life for residents.
I'd like to pose our final question to both of you. What role would you like to see schools play in helping disadvantaged students to move beyond poverty? Are there specific policies you'd like to see the legislature or local government enact?
Well, what I would say, and I'm not necessarily saying this from a legislative standpoint, but I would like to see that we would have, if you will, more community and school type education partnerships. And I think part of it is the school districts reaching out, but I also think it's what are our local government's role in making sure that our community is a healthy community, right? And so what does a healthy community mean? That means that our adults are gainfully employed. There are systems and processes in place for them to get more education so that they are able to support their families. I've always believed and firmly believe that children come to school as a result of what's happening in the home or in the community. And when you have a healthy community, you will have a healthy school system. And so we have to take a broader approach and look past just the K-12 education system. We have to look at it from the beginning all the way to the end. And so I'm talking about a K-16 system. What does that look like? How do we really create something that's going to not only benefit the students that are in K through 12, but what happens after that? And K-16 may not be going to college. It could be that you're going to a community college. It could be that you're going into the military. It could be that you're leaving with a certification to get a job. But you're able to basically be self-sustaining. And then that way, over time, what you have is a community that is healthy. So that's what I would offer or suggest. But again, I would not want to put it on any one local body or any elected official. I think we as a community have to come together and talk about what do we want in this community and what do we want it to be like. And we collectively create what we want to have in place.
Sharon, I'll give you the final word.
Sure. And I think this goes back to our earlier conversations, having teachers in the classroom, having more Black teachers, having more Spanish-speaking teachers, having kids see role models, the conversation around being able to see what the future looks like, I think that that's very important. Our early childhood education, and then not suffering from or eliminating, the curse of low expectations. There was just a recent study that I read, I don't know, over the weekend that was just about we consistently underestimate what kids can do. And I think that particularly for Black and Brown students, and I think if schools are able to address that, we'll see greater school success for all kids, including those who are disadvantaged, especially those who are disadvantaged.
I'd like to thank our panelists once again, Dr. Eric B. Coates, Sharon Ward, and State Representative Carrie Lewis Del Rosso. I'd also like to just mention that if you missed any portion of this, the entire City and State Education Summit will air on PCN Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to our MC, Greg Salisbury.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists, for another informative panel. I'd like to close by thanking Secretary Eric Haggerty for being our keynote speaker. Thank you to all our moderators and panelists. And thank you again to our sponsors, WHYY, Western Governors University, and PCN. Finally, thank you to all the attendees who joined us today, over 150 of you. Please make sure you're signed up for First Read, which can be found on our website at cityandstatepa.com. Don't forget to follow City and State PA on all our social media platforms to stay up to date on everything Pennsylvania politics and policy. And join us for our upcoming events, the 2022 Labor Power 100 in Philadelphia on September 7th, the 2022 Pennsylvania 50 over 50 in Philadelphia on October 4th, and the Philadelphia Power 100 also in Philadelphia on November 3rd. Our next summit will be about rebuilding Pennsylvania. That'll be held in Harrisburg on October 19th. Updates regarding all events can be found on our website. Thank you, and have a great rest of the afternoon.